Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity settles in for the evening and the ancient world is allowed to speak a little more slowly. Tonight, we're taking a quiet journey into one of the strangest questions left behind in stone. Not who built the ruins, not how old they are, not even why they were abandoned, but something more unusual, something that looks less like archaeology at first glance and more like the aftermath of a furnace. What melted these ancient ruins? It is a strange question, isn't it? Stone is supposed to be the stubborn one. Wood burns, cloth blackens, clay cracks, metal softens. But stone usually sits there with the calm confidence of something that has already seen enough weather to be unimpressed. It takes a great deal to make stone change its nature. You can chip it, carve it, stack it, polish it, knock it over, bury it in sand for a few thousand years, and it will still remain mostly itself, perhaps a little more tired around the edges. But in some places across the world, stones appear fused together, walls look glassy, forts seem vitrified, pottery is warped, mud brick is scorched into strange textures, and desert sand has been transformed into yellow glass, scattered across remote landscapes like fragments of frozen sunlight. And when we see those traces, the mind naturally leans forward a little, even if the body's already tucked under a blanket. Before we wander into this mystery, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Are you near old hills, a quiet city, a coastline, a desert, or somewhere with rain tapping gently on the window? And if you happen to know, what ancient place has always made you wonder? Maybe the pyramids, maybe Machu Picchu, maybe Stonehenge, maybe some small ruined wall near your own town that most people walk past without ever asking who placed the first stone there. There is something comforting about remembering that wherever we are living on top of many older stories. Some are written in books, some are carved into monuments, and some are sealed inside damaged stone, waiting for us to ask the right questions, or at least better questions than, who left all this rubble here? Which, to be fair, is probably what many tired archaeologists have muttered at some point, while standing under the sun with a notebook and a sandwich that has gone slightly sandy. If you find this journey soothing, curious, or simply a nice way to let the day loosen its grip, I'd be ever so grateful if you liked the video and subscribed. It helps this quiet corner of the internet reach other people who enjoy calm stories about Earth, history, science, and the occasional deeply suspicious-looking rock. And as always, I do hope this is interesting enough to keep your imagination awake, but gentle enough to let the rest of you drift whenever you are ready. There is no rush here. Ancient ruins have waited a very long time. They can wait a little longer while you get comfortable, so settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let your thoughts slow down. Tonight, we're not chasing treasure or trying to solve all of history in one dramatic leap. We are simply following a trail of heat across Scotland, where Iron Age hill forts contain stones fused into glassy masses, across Egypt, where traces of intense heat appear in ruined places, and far out in the Libyan Desert, where natural glass lies scattered across the sand, across Peru, where some ancient walls are so tightly joined and oddly shaped that people have long wondered whether lost techniques were involved, toward tall el-Hammam in the Jordan Valley, where some researchers have argued for a catastrophic burst from the sky, while others challenge that interpretation and ask for better evidence, toward Mohenjo-daro, a city wrapped in legends of sudden destruction, and toward Tanis, half buried in sand and story, where broken monuments and strange claims have gathered around the remains like desert dust. Each place has its own evidence, its own problems, its own explanations, and its own temptations. Because mysteries are not just found in the ground, they also happen inside us, in the space between what we can prove and what we badly want to imagine. The first thing to say, gently but clearly, is that not every melted-looking ruin was melted by the same thing. History is not that tidy. Earth rarely arranges itself into neat little categories for our convenience, which is inconsiderate of it, but probably unavoidable. Sometimes heat damage comes from ordinary fire, made extraordinary by fuel, wind, confinement, and time. A wooden structure burning inside a stone wall can create higher temperatures than we might expect. Charcoal, timber beams, packed earth, and narrow spaces can turn a simple blaze into something much more intense. Sometimes stone is not truly melted at all, but chemically altered, weathered, or coated with minerals that give it a glazed appearance. Sometimes ancient people deliberately fired materials, strengthened walls, made lime, baked bricks, or worked with temperatures far beyond what we casually imagine when we say campfire. And sometimes, just sometimes, the evidence seems to point toward events larger than a household fire or a battle, a city flattened, a layer of ash, grains of minerals altered by heat, glass formed where sand once lay, objects warped in ways that ask for closer attention. That is where the mystery begins to become interesting. Not because every strange ruin proves a lost super-civilization, and not because every patch of glassy stone must be the fingerprint of ancient technology. Those are exciting ideas, certainly, and they have filled many bookshelves, documentaries, late-night conversations, and probably a few comment sections that should have gone to bed earlier. But the real wonder is often deeper than a quick answer. The real wonder is that the ancient world was not quiet, simple, or primitive in the way we sometimes imagine. It was full of fire, craft, war, ritual, accident, engineering, climate shifts, earthquakes, impacts, floods, collapses, and human decisions made under pressure. It was a living world, just as complicated and messy as ours, though with fewer phone chargers lost behind furniture. When we look at a vitrified fort in Scotland, for example, we're not just looking at stones that got hot. We're looking at a puzzle of intention and circumstance. Were the walls burned during an attack? Were they deliberately fired as part of construction? Did people believe that fire could strengthen the walls? Did the burning happen after abandonment, during destruction, or as a ritual act? Different sites may have different answers, and that is important. The phrase vitrified fort sounds like it should describe one single phenomenon, one neat category, one mystery with a tidy label. But the forts themselves are varied. Some show only patches of vitrification. Others show fused stone over larger sections. Some stones melt more easily because of their mineral content, while others resist. The wall must contain the right rocks, the right fuels, the right airflow, and the right conditions. It is less like lighting a candle and more like accidentally inventing an outdoor kiln with a bad attitude. Then there is the desert glass of North Africa, especially the pale yellow-green material found in the Great Sand Sea near the border of Egypt and Libya. This glass is not part of a city wall, and yet it belongs to our story, because it shows what extreme natural forces can do to the surface of Earth. Sand, mostly silica, can become glass if heated enough. We know this in the ordinary sense because glassmaking is an ancient craft. But the Libyan Desert glass seems to have formed on a much larger natural scale, long before any human civilization could have made it. Scientists have debated whether it came from a meteor impact, a powerful airburst, or some related high-energy event. There is no simple fireplace explanation for glass spread over that desert region. Something fierce happened there in deep time, something hot enough to transform sand into glass and leave behind material that much later would be carved into objects precious enough for kings. It is a reminder that Earth is not merely a stage for human history. Earth has its own history, and sometimes it writes with heat. That thought matters when we approach stories of ancient cities destroyed suddenly. Tall el-Hammam is one of the most debated examples. Some researchers have suggested that a cosmic airburst, something like the Tunguska event in Siberia, but in an ancient settled landscape, could explain signs of severe destruction. A body from space might explode in the atmosphere, releasing heat, shock, and pressure without leaving a classic crater. It is an idea that sounds dramatic because it is dramatic. But science does not become true just because it makes an excellent scene. Other researchers have criticised the evidence and interpretations, and the debate around this site is a useful reminder that mystery must be handled carefully. A good story asks questions. A careless story grabs the loudest answer and runs downhill with it, usually dropping half the facts on the way. Still, the possibility of cosmic catastrophe is not fantasy by itself. The sky has struck Earth before, meteorites fall. Asteroids have shaped the history of life. Airbursts have happened in recorded times, and even smaller ones can shatter windows, flatten forests, and frighten everyone into looking up a little more respectfully. If such an event happened over an ancient settlement, the people living there would not have described it in terms of atmospheric entry, pressure waves, thermal radiation, or high-energy physics. They might have remembered fire from the sky, a roaring wind, a city broken in a day, or a divine punishment. Later generations might turn it into myth, and later still, archaeologists might stand in a trench trying to separate memory, symbolism, geology and chemistry, while also remembering where they put the trowel. Mohenjo-daro is another place where mystery has often outrun evidence. The ancient induced city is remarkable enough without embellishment. Its streets, drains, baked bricks, planning and scale speak of a sophisticated urban culture, and yet around it have grown dramatic claims of ancient explosions, radiation, bodies lying in the streets, and heat damage beyond ordinary explanation. Many of these claims do not hold up well when compared with archaeological records, but they persist because Mohenjo-daro feels like the kind of place that should contain a secret. It is old, impressive, partially silent and not fully understood. Humans are very good at filling silence with stories. Sometimes those stories help us imagine, sometimes they mislead us. Often they do both at once, which is why history is less like a locked box and more like a cupboard full of carefully labelled jars, several of which may contain biscuits, and one of which definitely contains old screws. The same pull of imagination follows many ancient places. Egypt, with its ruined temples and broken colossi, naturally attracts theories of lost power and forgotten machines. Peru, with its fitted stones at sites like el-Hammam and other Andean monuments, invites questions about engineering, tools, transport and technique. Tanis, buried and rediscovered, carries the romance of a city dragged into the modern imagination by archaeology and cinema alike. In each case, the danger is not curiosity. Curiosity is good. Curiosity is the lamp we carry into dark rooms. The danger is deciding too quickly that because something is difficult to explain, it must belong to the most dramatic explanation available. Ancient people were capable, patient, clever, experimental, and sometimes stubborn beyond measure. Given enough time, enough hands, and enough social motivation, humans can do extraordinary things with stone. Anyone who has ever watched someone assemble flat-pack furniture with no instructions and a sense of personal pride will understand that determination is a powerful technology. But neither should we flatten the ancient world into something too ordinary. There are genuine mysteries. There are materials altered by heat. There are ruined settlements with destruction layers. There are stones fused in ways that require explanation. There are natural glasses that speak of temperatures most landscapes never experience. There are ancient techniques we do not fully understand because the people who used them did not always leave manuals, diagrams, or helpful little labels saying, "This wall was built using method B. Please see appendix." The past often gives us results without instructions. A wall stands, a stone fits, a glaze shines, a city burns, and we arrive much later with questions, instruments, theories, and occasionally rather strong opinions. So tonight we will move carefully. We will not treat every legend as fact, but we will not dismiss every strange trace with a wave of the hand either. We will ask what heat can do to stone, how hot ancient fires could become, what vitrification actually means, how cosmic events might affect the ground, and why certain ruins have inspired stories of lost civilizations or global catastrophe. We will look at the difference between evidence and interpretation, because that difference is where many mysteries either sharpen or fall apart. Evidence is the thing in the ground. Interpretation is the story we build around it. Both matter, but they are not the same thing. Glassy surface may tell us that something became hot. It does not by itself tell us whether the cause was an enemy army, a ritual fire, a kiln-like accident, a lightning strike, a meteor airburst, volcanic material, a modern contamination, or an ancient engineer having an unusually ambitious afternoon. And yet, the question remains lovely in its strangeness. What melted these ancient ruins? It is the sort of question that makes the old world feel close again. Not dead, not distant, not reduced to museum labels, but active and unresolved. It asks us to imagine the heat of ancient fires, the pressure of collapsing walls, the glare of a desert sky, the roar of a city in crisis, and the quiet afterward, when smoke lifts and stone remains changed. It asks us to consider that civilization is fragile, that memory is incomplete, and that Earth has seen forces powerful enough to erase, reshape, and confuse the traces people leave behind. It also asks us to be humble. The past is not obligated to match our theories. It does not become simpler because we prefer a simple answer. It sits there, weathered and patient, while generation after generation arrives, points at the same stones and says, "Well, that's odd." There is something soothing in that, oddly enough. Not in destruction itself, of course, but in the act of slow attention. To study a ruin is to sit with time. To notice heat damage on a wall is to remember that even stone has a history. To examine a shard of glass in the desert is to hold a moment when sand stopped being sand and became something else. The ancient world can seem remote, but these traces make it physical. A burned brick, a fused rock, a cracked surface, a layer of ash. These are not just symbols, they are materials that changed under real conditions. They were touched by temperature, pressure, chemistry, and time. They are quiet witnesses, and though they do not speak in words, they do record. As we begin, it may help to set aside the need for one grand answer. Perhaps some ruins were damaged by ordinary fires made intense by architecture. Perhaps some were altered by deliberate burning. Perhaps some glass came from cosmic violence. Perhaps some famous stories are misunderstandings, while others preserve a distorted memory of real catastrophe. Perhaps lost techniques explain certain stones better than lost civilizations. Perhaps, here and there, a mystery remains because the evidence is genuinely incomplete. The interesting part is not choosing the most exciting answer before the journey begins. The interesting part is following each clue long enough to see what it can bear. So imagine for a moment standing before an ancient wall at dusk. The stones are dark in places, shiny in others. Some edges are rounded not by rain or wind, but by heat. A few fragments look almost fused together, as if the wall briefly forgot it was stone and tried to become glass. Around you, the air is cool now. Birds move somewhere in the distance. Grass grows where people once stood guard, traded goods, cooked meals, argued, prayed, carried water, told jokes, and worried about things that probably felt as urgent as our own worries do. The fire, whatever it was, is long gone. The people are gone. The noise is gone. But the wall still holds the question, and that is where we will start. Not with an answer, not yet, but with the material itself. Stone, heat, glass, ash, and the strange threshold where ordinary fire becomes something more unsettling. Because before we can ask whether ancient ruins were melted by war, accident, ritual, technology, or catastrophe, we need to understand what it actually takes to melt stone in the first place, and why some ancient walls seem to have crossed that line while others, standing in the same long weather of history, did not. To understand why a wall might look as though it has faced a furnace, we first need to spend a little time with the wall itself, not the legend around it, not the dramatic painting we might imagine of fire falling from the sky, not the excited voice in the back of the mind whispering ancient machines, which is an entertaining voice, but not always the most reliable one after midnight. We need to look at the material: stone, brick, clay, sand, mortar, timber, ash, air, pressure, and time. These are ordinary things, the basic ingredients of old settlements and fortifications, but under the right conditions, ordinary things can behave in very surprising ways. A wall can stand for centuries looking sensible and dependable. Then one layer of it tells a much stranger story. The stone is darkened. The surface is glassy. Some rocks seem to have softened around the edges. In places, separate blocks appear fused, as if the wall briefly became less like masonry and more like something poured. And when you see that, even if you are a careful person with a clipboard and sensible shoes, it is difficult not to ask what kind of fire could have done this. Most of us think of fire in familiar terms. A candle flame, a fireplace, a bonfire, a stove, a kettle that takes far too long to boil when you're watching it directly. These are everyday fires, and although they can burn, scorch and destroy, they do not usually make us imagine stone melting. If you place a rock beside a campfire, it may blacken, crack or pop if trapped moisture turns into steam, but it will not normally slump into glass like cheese on toast. Stone has a reputation for endurance because, compared with wood or cloth or skin, it really is stubborn. Many common rocks require very high temperatures before they begin to melt, often far beyond what we associate with a domestic fire. And yet the ancient world knew how to make very hot environments. Potters, metalworkers, lime burners, glass makers, and brick makers all learned, through long experience, that fire can be controlled, concentrated, fed, and shaped. A fire in open air is one thing. A fire inside a structure that traps heat is another. A fire supplied with dry timber, charcoal, wind, and enclosed spaces can become less like a campfire and more like an accidental industrial process, with no safety inspection and very poor signage. This is why the phrase melted stone needs to be handled carefully. In ordinary speech, melted means something softening into liquid, like wax running down a candle or butter disappearing into toast. With stone, the reality can be more complicated. A rock is not one single substance. It is a mixture of minerals, each with its own behaviour under heat. Some minerals begin to soften or react before the whole rock melts. Some break down chemically. Some release gases. Some turn red, black, white, or grey. Some form glassy patches where lower melting components have fused together. In a wall, different stones may sit next to each other, each responding differently. One block may remain almost unchanged, while another nearby becomes blistered and glossy. The result can look as if the wall was struck by a strange selective flame, a flame with oddly specific tastes, as though it looked at one stone and said, "You, yes," and looked at the next and said, "No, you may continue as you were." Vitrification is the word often used when materials are transformed into a glassy state. It does not always mean the entire wall became liquid. It may mean that parts of the stone, clay, or other material heated enough to fuse and cool into a glass-like substance. In ancient walls, vitrification can appear as shiny coatings, fused joints, slag-like lumps, bubbly textures, or dark glassy patches binding stones together. The surface can look like it has been glazed, almost as if someone painted it with heat and then let it harden. This is where the mystery becomes so visually powerful. A normal ruined wall can be explained by weather, neglect, battle, earthquake, or the simple boredom of centuries. A glassy wall feels different. It looks processed. It looks changed by an event. It seems to carry the memory of an intensity we cannot see anymore. But to know whether that intensity was extraordinary, we need to ask what ancient fires could realistically do. A house fire in the ancient world could burn fiercely, especially if the building contained timber beams, reed mats, storage jars, oil, textiles, grain, furniture and roofing materials. Mud brick walls could bake harder, clay floors could redden, pottery could overfire and warp, plaster could crack, stone near the hottest zones could spool, flake or alter. If the structure collapsed during the fire, rubble could trap heat underneath, allowing some areas to remain hot for a long time. Add wind, and the fire may behave like a bellows, pulling oxygen through gaps and raising temperatures. Add large quantities of timber deliberately packed into a wall, and you have something closer to a kiln than a simple blaze. The past did not need electricity to create extreme heat. It needed fuel, airflow, confinement, and patience, and ancient people had at least 3 of those in abundance. Patience especially seems to have been much more common before loading screens and instant messages ruined us all. Still, even intense fires leave patterns. This is one of the reasons archaeologists do not simply see burned material and leap to a dramatic conclusion. A carefully excavated destruction layer can tell a great deal. Was the burning spread evenly or concentrated in certain rooms? Did the roof collapse first? Are charred beams preserved? Are storage jars still in place? Are mud bricks baked only on one side? Are floors covered with ash? Are there signs of rapid abandonment, like valuables left behind, or does the site show gradual decay? Did the heat come from below, above, inside, or outside? These questions matter because heat damage is like a footprint. It may not tell you the whole story, but it tells you something about direction, pressure, and movement. A wall burned from an internal structure does not look exactly like a wall struck by a sudden external blast. A pottery kiln does not look the same as a collapsed palace fire. A lightning strike leaves different clues from a furnace, and an airburst would be expected to leave a pattern broader and stranger still. There are also important differences between materials. Limestone, for example, does not behave like granite. When heated strongly, limestone can break down into lime and release carbon dioxide, a process ancient people deliberately used to make lime for plaster and mortar. Sandstone, depending on its cement and mineral content, may redden, crack, or in some cases partially fuse. Basalt and other volcanic rocks contain minerals that may melt at different temperatures. Mud brick can turn hard and ceramic-like if fired, which is one reason ancient burned buildings can sometimes preserve surprisingly well. Clay, when heated enough, changes permanently. Anyone who has handled pottery knows this. A soft, wet material becomes something durable. Ancient people learned that transformation long before modern chemistry described it. Fire was both destroyer and maker, which is probably why it was treated with such respect, fear, and ritual attention in so many cultures. A wall that appears furnace-struck may therefore be recording not just destruction, but technology. This is one of the quieter possibilities, and often one of the more interesting. Ancient builders used fire deliberately in many ways. They burned limestone to make lime. They fired bricks. They made pottery. They smelted ores. They produced glass and faience. They hardened materials and sometimes used burning as part of building or demolition. If a ruin contains glazed surfaces, fused debris, or overfired materials, the cause might be nearby craft activity rather than a disaster. A workshop, kiln, or industrial area can leave heat signatures that later observers mistake for evidence of sudden destruction. It is a little like finding flour, sugar, and broken eggs in a kitchen and deciding there must have been an explosion, when perhaps someone was simply making a cake with too much confidence. At the same time, there are sites where the scale of heating seems difficult to explain with casual fire alone. This is what makes vitrified walls so compelling. If stones inside a defensive wall are fused together, the question becomes practical. How much fuel would be required? How long would the wall need to burn? Was there timber lacing inside the wall that could have acted as fuel? Did the wall structure create spaces where heat could concentrate? Were the stones chosen partly because they responded well to heat? Or was that accidental? If attackers set fire to timber within a wall, was vitrification a side effect of warfare? If builders deliberately burned the wall, did they believe it strengthened the structure, even if later experiments suggest heating could sometimes weaken it? These are not small questions. They involve engineering, geology, intention, and social behaviour. A fused wall is not just a burned object. It is a conversation between human design and material limits. One useful way to think about this is to imagine a simple stone wall with timber running through it. Timber-laced walls were known in parts of ancient Europe. The wood could help bind the structure while it was standing, but it also created a dangerous possibility. If the timber caught fire, the heat would not simply pass around the outside, it would burn through the body of the wall. Flames, embers and hot gases could move through gaps between stones. The wall itself could become an oven, with heat trapped inside rather than escaping upward. If the fire burned long enough, certain minerals might soften and fuse. The result could be patches of vitrification, especially where the temperature was highest and the rock chemistry was favourable. This does not require lost lasers, mysterious rays, or a forgotten power plant hidden under a hill, though such ideas do have a talent for making people click thumbnails. It requires a very hot, sustained fire in the right materials. That explanation may sound less dramatic, but from a practical point of view it is still remarkable. Accidentally turning a defensive wall into a partial glass mass is not exactly an everyday mishap, even for a society with a relaxed approach to building regulations. Yet we should not imagine ancient people as unaware of what fire could do. People who worked with kilns understood draft, fuel and heat by experience. They knew that airflow mattered. They knew certain woods burned hotter. They knew charcoal could produce intense heat. They knew enclosed spaces behaved differently from open flames. They may not have spoken in modern temperature measurements, but they had observational knowledge sharpened by necessity. A potter whose kiln fails loses work. A metal worker whose fire is not hot enough cannot smelt or forge properly. A lime burner whose kiln cools too soon wastes fuel. Ancient fire technology was not primitive simply because it lacked digital thermometers. It was practical, skilled, and sometimes very efficient. A person can know exactly how to control heat without ever writing down a number, just as a good cook can know when bread is ready by smell, colour and touch, while the rest of us poke it nervously and hope for the best. This matters because some mysteries become less mysterious when we remember ancient skill. Glazed pottery does not imply impossible heat. Pottery is made through controlled heat. Fused brick does not automatically imply catastrophe. Brick can overfire, deform or vitrify in a kiln or in a severe building fire. Glassy slag near ancient ruins may come from metalworking. A shiny surface on stone may be natural mineral coating, weathering, desert varnish, or human-applied glaze. Even desert glass, though formed by exceptional natural events, shows that heat and silica can create beautiful materials without human technology at all. The Earth itself can make glass through lightning, volcanic activity, impacts, and other high-energy processes. Nature has always had access to machinery that would make human engineers look modest. Volcanoes do not ask for planning permission. Lightning does not submit risk assessments. Meteors do not check whether anyone has moved the laundry indoors. One of the most helpful tools in separating these possibilities is microscopic analysis. To the naked eye, a surface may simply look melted. Under a microscope, the story can become more specific. Tiny crystals may show whether minerals were heated, transformed, or shocked. Bubbles in glass can suggest gases released during melting. Flow textures may show that material actually became liquid. Chemical composition can reveal whether the glass came from local stone, clay, sand, ash, or some introduced material. Magnetic changes can show heating temperatures. Fractures can suggest thermal shock. Mineral phases can point to extreme pressure or impact conditions. In other words, the ruin may look silent, but the material has a vocabulary. It speaks in crystals, textures, elements, and tiny structural changes too small for the eye to catch. Scientists are not merely standing around saying, "Looks a bit burnt, doesn't it?" Though that may still be the first sentence anyone says when they arrive. The difficulty is that ancient sites are messy. A wall may have been built, repaired, burned, robbed for stone, exposed to weather, buried, dug up, misidentified, reinterpreted, and then photographed from a flattering angle for a book with a dramatic title. Each stage can add confusion. Later fires can affect earlier ruins. Modern activity can contaminate ancient layers. Salt, wind, rain, and temperature changes can alter surfaces. People may move stones from one place to another. A sample taken from one part of a site may not represent the whole site. This is why careful context is everything. A melted-looking stone in isolation tells us less than the same stone documented within a sealed layer, alongside datable material, with clear association to other evidence. Archaeology is not just about objects, it is about relationships between objects. A shard, a beam, a wall, a floor, an ash layer and a collapsed roof all become more meaningful when their positions are understood. Without context, even a very interesting object can become a free-floating mystery, and free-floating mysteries tend to attract speculation the way porch lights attract moths. This is especially important when people speak about heat beyond ordinary fire. That phrase sounds impressive, but ordinary fire is not one temperature. A candle, a campfire, a house fire, a charcoal furnace, a pottery kiln, a lime kiln, and a smelting furnace are all fires, but they operate in very different conditions. A wildfire moving quickly across open ground may not heat stone deeply. A kiln, enclosed and fed properly, can reach temperatures that alter clay and minerals dramatically. A burning city can contain many micro-environments, from low-temperature smouldering rooms to very hot, oxygen-rich pockets. A single site can therefore preserve a wide range of heat damage. If we say ordinary fire could not do this, we have to specify what kind of ordinary fire we mean. The fire under a stew pot is not the same as the fire in a charcoal-fed furnace, and neither is the same as a timber-packed wall burning from the inside for hours. There is also the matter of pressure. Heat alone is not always the full story. Some catastrophic events involve shock waves, rapid heating, high winds, falling debris, and sudden changes in pressure. A meteor airburst, for instance, would not behave like a ground fire. It could produce intense thermal radiation over a broad area, followed by a pressure wave. That does not mean every burned ruin is an airburst site, far from it. But it gives us a category of natural event that can, in principle, cause destruction unlike ordinary warfare. The challenge is proving it. A strong claim requires strong evidence, and for an airburst that might include unusual melt products, high-temperature minerals, shocked grains, geochemical signatures, a regional destruction pattern, and a dating match. Without that, a dramatic skyfire explanation remains possible in imagination, but not established in evidence. Science is not trying to spoil the mystery. It is trying to stop the mystery from being solved too early by the loudest guess in the room. Ancient warfare also complicates the picture. Burning a fort, city gate, palace, or temple was not unusual. Fire was a weapon, a signal, a punishment, and a method of clearing. Attackers could pile fuel against walls or gates. Defenders could burn structures to deny them to enemies. Conquerors could destroy symbolic buildings to break political power. In some cases, fire was not accidental aftermath but the main act. A city in flames can create conditions far more intense than a tidy little hearth. Roofs collapse, air flows through broken openings, stores of oil or grain ignite, and heat becomes trapped in rubble. If a stone surface is found reddened, cracked or glazed, the cause may be a violent human event rather than a cosmic one. That is not less tragic or less powerful. A burned city is already dramatic enough without adding meteors. Human beings have always been quite capable of ruining each other's afternoons on a very large scale. And then there is ritual. Not every ancient burning was practical or military. Fire has long been used in ceremonies of closure, purification, transformation, dedication, and destruction. Some buildings may have been deliberately burned when abandoned. Some objects were passed through fire as offerings. Some monuments may have been altered in ways that made sense within belief systems we only partly understand. A vitrified or burned structure might therefore represent meaning, not merely accident. This can be difficult for modern minds because we often separate practical construction from symbolic action. But ancient builders did not always draw that line sharply. A wall could defend, display power, mark identity, and participate in ritual all at once. Burning it might be an act of destruction, but it could also be an act of transformation. Fire changes materials visibly and permanently. It turns wood to charcoal, clay to ceramic, limestone to lime, ore to metal, sand to glass. It is easy to see why people might have regarded it as a force that did more than consume. When an ancient wall looks furnace-struck, then, it stands at the crossing of many explanations. It might be evidence of a severe accidental fire. It might be the result of warfare. It might be a deliberate engineering attempt. It might be ritual burning. It might reflect industrial activity nearby. It might be natural alteration mistaken for melting. It might, in rarer cases, point to a larger catastrophe involving impacts, airbursts, volcanic heat, or lightning. Each possibility leaves different clues, though those clues are not always preserved clearly. The wall becomes a question not because there are no answers, but because there are too many possible answers until the evidence narrows them down. That is what makes the subject so interesting. It is not a simple contest between mainstream history and forbidden mystery. It is a slow sorting of causes, a careful effort to match material traces with events that could realistically produce them. Still, the visual impression is hard to forget. Imagine approaching a ruined rampart where the stones do not sit cleanly one upon another but are locked together by dark, glassy seams. Some surfaces are bubbled, as if gases push through softening minerals. Some edges are rounded, the sharpness gone. Other stones nearby remain rough and ordinary, looking almost innocent. The whole wall seems caught between construction and collapse, between architecture and geology. It is still a human-made structure, but it has been changed by a process usually associated with kilns, volcanoes, lightning, or impacts. That is why people return to these places and keep asking questions. The wall has crossed a boundary in our imagination. It is no longer only built stone, it is cooked stone. There is a simple human reason this unsettles us. Ruins already remind us that civilizations do not last forever. Melted-looking ruins add another layer. They suggest not just abandonment but intensity. Something happened here. Something hot enough to leave a mark that outlived the people, the language, the argument, the emergency, and the final footsteps away from the site. A broken wall can be blamed on time. A scorched and fused wall feels more sudden. It makes us think of heat, noise, smoke, panic, or deliberate effort. It turns the ruin into an event. And because we do not always know the event clearly, our imagination supplies possibilities. Some are careful, some are wild. Some sit in the middle, wearing a respectable hat and hoping not to be asked too many questions. The best approach is to let the stones be strange without forcing them to be impossible. A vitrified surface is remarkable even if it was made by a sustained timber fire. A fused brick is meaningful even if it came from a collapsed building rather than an unknown weapon. A desert glass fragment is astonishing even if its cause was a natural impact process rather than human design. We do not have to make ancient people helpless in order to be impressed by them, and we do not have to turn every mystery into a lost technology to feel wonder. The past is already difficult, skilled, violent, inventive, and surprising. It does not need much decoration, though, like an old cake at a village fair, people will keep adding layers anyway. As we move toward the first of the great examples, keep this in mind. Heat does not leave one simple signature. It leaves a family of signatures, and each must be read in context. The colour of the stone, the shape of the glass, the chemistry of the melt, the presence of ash, the arrangement of the wall, the local geology, the history of the site, and the date of the damage all matter. A ruin that looks like a furnace may indeed have faced one, but the furnace may have been a burning wall, a collapsed building, a kiln-like accident, a ritual fire, or something far larger and rarer. The mystery is not whether ancient ruins can show extreme heat damage. They can. The mystery is why, in certain places, the heat seems to have gone so far that stone itself became part of the fire's memory. And there is perhaps no better place to begin following that memory than the hill forts of Scotland, where cold winds move over green slopes, sheep graze beside old ramparts, and stones built for defence sometimes bear the unmistakable look of having once burned with a heat that still troubles anyone who tries to explain it too quickly. The hills of Scotland are not the first place most people imagine when they think of melted stone. We might picture volcanoes, deserts, craters, or some dramatic landscape where the ground itself looks as though it once lost an argument with the sun. Scotland, by contrast, brings to mind green slopes, cold wind, mist, rain, old paths, sheep with very serious expressions, and the sort of weather that makes a hot drink feel less like a preference and more like a survival strategy. And yet, scattered across parts of Scotland are ancient hill forts whose walls bear a mark that seems, at first, entirely out of place. Not just burned, not merely blackened, but vitrified, fused, changed by heat until sections of stone became glassy, clumped, and locked together in a way that still makes people stop, crouch down, touch the rock if they are allowed to, and wonder what on earth happened here. A hill fort is already a deeply human thing. It is not just a wall on a hill. It is a statement. It says that people gathered here, planned here, feared here, organised here, and chose the high ground because the high ground mattered. From up there, you could see movement in the landscape. You could watch paths, valleys, rivers, and approaches. You could protect people, animals, stores of food, tools, and perhaps status itself. A hill fort is practical, but it is also social. It gathers labour. It tells neighbours that a community has strength enough to move stone and timber and shape a summit into a defended place. And then, at some of these sites, that statement was altered by fire so intense that parts of the wall no longer behaved like normal stonework. The wall was not simply knocked down. It was cooked into something stranger. The classic image is a rampart made of stone, sometimes with timber lacing running through it, burned so fiercely that the inner rubble core partially melted and fused. In some places, the stones appear bonded together by a glassy material. In others, the vitrification is patchy, appearing in lumps or streaks rather than across the whole structure. That patchiness matters. If some impossible force had swept evenly over a fort, we might expect a more uniform pattern. But vitrified forts often show heat working unevenly, depending on where the fuel was, how air moved through the wall, what kinds of rock were present, and how long the burning continued. The wall becomes less like a single object and more like a record of many small conditions happening at once. A gust of air here, a timber beam there, a pocket of heat trapped inside, a stone that melts more easily sitting beside one that refuses to cooperate, rather like two people sharing a blanket where one is too warm and the other is still complaining about their feet. One famous Scottish example is Dun Deerdale, high above Glen Nevis, with Ben Nevis rising nearby like a large patient neighbour. Dun Deerdale was an Iron Age fort, and its name is linked in later tradition to Deirdre, the tragic figure from Irish legend. Even before the vitrification is considered, the location has a presence. It sits in a landscape that feels both open and enclosed, with the valley below and the mountains around it. To build there was to choose visibility, effort, and meaning. Archaeological work has shown that the fort's defences were burned at very high temperatures for long enough that stones in the ramparts fused together. That is already a remarkable fact. But the question that follows is the one that keeps the whole subject alive. Was this destruction caused by attack, accident, deliberate burning, ritual closure, or some combination of motives that no longer separates neatly for us? At first, the simplest thought is warfare. Forts are built because conflict is possible, and fire is one of humanity's oldest weapons. If an enemy wanted to destroy a defended place, burning its timber elements would be an obvious method. Wooden gates, internal beams, palisades, dwellings, stores and wall lacing could all catch. Once fire entered a timber-laced rampart, it might not behave like an ordinary blaze licking the outside of a wall. It could burn within the wall, using the structure itself as a kind of tunnel and container. The stones would trap heat, gaps would draw air, timber would feed the flame, rubble would hold warmth long after the open flames had passed. Under those conditions, the heart of the wall could become a furnace, not because anyone had a magical weapon, but because the wall accidentally provided the ingredients of one. It is a little like discovering that your sensible winter coat, under very specific conditions, can become a toaster. Not ideal, but technically educational. Yet warfare does not answer everything. At some vitrified forts, there are signs that people may have cleared valuable materials before the burning. If a community knew the fort was being abandoned, the final fire might have been deliberate. Not necessarily destructive in the simple sense, but ceremonial, practical, or symbolic. Perhaps the burning marked the end of the site's life. Perhaps it was a way to decommission a place, to transform it, to make it unusable by rivals, or to create a visible statement. A vitrified wall would not be subtle. Imagine flames on a hill at night, visible from the surrounding land, the heat roaring through timbers, the stones glowing, smoke rising above the valley. People far away would have seen it. They may have understood it as loss, victory, warning, ritual, or something we no longer have the language to name properly. Archaeology can show the burned material, but it cannot always recover the conversation people had while watching it. The idea of deliberate vitrification has a long history because the process itself seems so effortful. Why would anyone go to the trouble of building a wall and then burning it until parts fused? For a time, some suggested it might have strengthened the fortifications. After all, fused stone sounds stronger than loose rubble. But experiments and observations have made that answer less tidy. Vitrification does not always penetrate deeply or evenly. It may create hard fused zones while also cracking, weakening, or destabilizing other parts of the wall. Heating stone can damage it. Different minerals expand at different rates, causing fractures. Some stones spall or crumble, so if vitrification was meant to strengthen the whole wall, it was a risky and inconsistent method. Ancient people were clever, certainly, but clever people can still try ideas that do not work perfectly. Anyone who has ever decided to fix a small household problem and created a larger one with a screwdriver will understand that experimentation is not the same as guaranteed success. Another possibility is that vitrification was not the original goal at all. It may have been a side effect of burning a timber-laced wall after the fort had served its purpose. Timber lacing itself was practical. Wood within a stone rampart could help tie the wall together during construction and use. But it also made the wall vulnerable to fire. If burned, the structure could reach temperatures high enough to partially melt certain rocks, especially when the wall's design helped trap heat. This is where geology becomes important. Not all stone melts at the same temperature. A fort built from one type of local rock might vitrify more readily than another built from different stone. Some mixtures begin to soften or partially melt before others. The availability of rock was usually local, because moving tons of stone up a hill is already enough trouble without deciding to import a more fashionable variety from far away. Ancient builders used what the landscape offered, and the landscape quietly influenced what the fire could later do. This local geology may be one reason Scotland has so many striking examples. The rocks, wall designs, and burning conditions combined in certain places to create vitrification. It was not simply that someone made an extremely hot fire and the stones obediently turned glassy. The chemistry mattered, the structure mattered, the airflow mattered, the duration mattered. To produce vitrification, the fire needed to remain intense enough, in the right places, for long enough that minerals could begin to melt or fuse. That is not easy. Open flames lose heat quickly to the air, A wall, however, can trap heat inside itself. If timber is embedded within the wall, the fire does not merely sit outside like a guest at the door, it moves into the bones of the structure, it becomes internal, and that changes everything. Taparnoth in Aberdeenshire is another important example, and it has the sort of name that sounds as if it belongs in a folk tale even before the archaeology begins. It sits on a high summit above the surrounding countryside, and its vitrified inner fort is enclosed by substantial walls. The broader site has also drawn attention because surveys have suggested a large surrounding settlement on the slopes, with many hut platforms. This means Taparnoth was not simply a lonely wall on a hill, but part of a wider human landscape. People lived, worked, moved, and gathered around it. When we talk about vitrification there, we're not talking about an isolated geological curiosity. We're talking about a fortified place embedded in a social world, later burned or transformed in a way that left the stone altered. The walls at such sites can look dramatic, and that drama has inspired many theories. Over the centuries, vitrified forts were attributed to everything from ancient battles to lost construction methods to mysterious forgotten powers. It is easy to see why. A person walking over a green Scottish hill and finding stones fused into glassy masses might reasonably feel that an ordinary explanation is not quite enough. The mind reaches for something large: a terrible fire, a siege, a ritual, a weapon, a catastrophe. Perhaps even, for those who like their history with extra lightning, some advance force from a forgotten age. But the difficulty is that ordinary and extraordinary are not fixed categories. A timber-laced wall burning at high temperature for hours may be ordinary in the sense that it uses normal materials, but extraordinary in the sense that the result is rare, difficult, and visually startling. A forge is ordinary technology, but it can turn ore into metal. A kiln is ordinary technology, but it can transform clay forever. Ordinary processes, pushed hard enough, can leave extraordinary traces. The experimental side of the question is especially interesting because people have tried to reproduce vitrification. Experiments have shown that creating glassy fused stone is possible, but also difficult. It can require large amounts of fuel, controlled airflow, the right stone, and sustained high heat. This makes the ancient vitrification neither impossible nor casual. It sits in a middle zone. It can be done without modern technology, but it is not something that happens every time someone lights a few logs against a wall. That middle zone is often where the best mysteries live. Not impossible, but not trivial. Not magical, but not simple. It is the sort of result that makes you respect ancient fire management while still wondering why people chose or allowed such a thing to happen. One of the older experiments often discussed involved attempts to build and burn sections of wall to see whether vitrification could be produced. These experiments did not always recreate the full effect seen at the ancient sites, and that is informative in itself. It suggests that the ancient conditions were specific and perhaps more complex than a basic reconstruction. Maybe the walls contained more timber than expected. Maybe the stones were arranged in ways that improved heat retention. Maybe the fires burned longer. Maybe natural wind conditions helped. Maybe the builders or burners knew techniques that are hard to reproduce from the ruins alone. The absence of an easy experimental result does not prove impossible technology. It simply reminds us that practical knowledge can disappear. A method obvious to people who built these walls may not be obvious to us, especially when all we have left is rubble, charcoal, fused stone, and a deep desire to make the past behave itself. The temperatures involved are another source of fascination. To partially melt many common rocks, we're often talking about heat in the range associated with kilns and furnaces, not an ordinary hearth. Exact temperatures depend on the rock type, but the point remains that this was serious heat. When people say the fire shouldn't be enough, they usually mean that a simple open-air fire should not melt stone walls, and that is fair, but the wall fire was probably not simple. A timber-laced rampart could create an enclosed combustion environment, especially if collapsing material trapped hot gases and embers. Charcoal formation inside the wall could help maintain high temperatures. Air drawn through gaps might act like a natural bellows. In strong winds, a hilltop site could become even more intense. Scotland may be damp, yes, but anyone who has stood on a Scottish hill knows that wind is not in short supply. It arrives with enthusiasm, rearranges your hair, questions your clothing choices, and, in the right circumstances, feeds fire very effectively. Still, if wind and timber explain how, they do not fully explain why. This is the part that remains open and gently stubborn. Why burn a fort so thoroughly? If it was enemy attack, was the goal simply to destroy? If it was abandonment, was the burning planned? If it was ritual, what did it mean? If vitrification occurred during construction, was it intentional or an experiment? Different forts may have different answers. That point is important because the label vitrified fort can mislead us into imagining one single ancient practice. But Scotland's vitrified forts are spread across different regions, settings and histories. They were not all made in one afternoon by the same person with a very ambitious box of matches. Each site needs its own explanation. Some may represent attack, some may represent abandonment, some may have been burned deliberately as a display, some may have been affected by later fires, and some may preserve combinations of events that we can only partly reconstruct. The visual effect has also encouraged comparisons with more extreme forces. If stone is fused, surely the heat must have been beyond anything ancient people could manage. But that assumption underestimates both ancient technology and the strange power of contained fire. The ancient world did not have steel skyscrapers or electric grids, but it did have fire specialists. It had potters who understood clay bodies and kiln atmospheres by experience. It had metal workers who could reach smelting temperatures. It had charcoal makers, lime burners, glass makers, and people who knew that a fire's behaviour changes when you control air and enclosure. A vitrified fort does not require a lost electrical system. It requires the right combination of wall design, fuel, rock, and burning conditions. That answer may not be as spectacular as a forgotten weapon, but it has its own quiet force. It turns ancient builders and burners into skilled participants in a difficult material process, not passive people waiting around for mystery to happen to them. At the same time, we should not overcorrect and pretend everything is solved neatly. Some sites remain difficult. Some vitrification is extensive. Some patterns are hard to explain. Some questions about timing, intention, and social meaning remain unanswered. The chemistry may be understood better than the motive. We may know that the wall burned hot enough, but not why it was burned in that way. That is a common situation in archaeology. The material evidence answers one question, and immediately opens three more. It is rather like asking someone where they put the biscuits, and receiving a detailed explanation of medieval trade routes. Interesting, but not quite the thing you were after. Standing at a vitrified fort, one can imagine several possible scenes. In one, attackers come at dusk, piling brush and timber against a gate or exposed wall, while defenders retreat and smoke begins to thicken. In another, the community has already left, carrying tools, food, valuables and memory, before setting fire to the rampart as a final act. In another, the burning is ceremonial, watched from below as flames crown the hill. In another, the wall burns accidentally after internal timbers catch, and what was meant to hold the structure together becomes the fuel that transforms it. None of these scenes requires impossible technology. All of them involve human choices, danger, heat, and loss. And all of them would leave behind more than just rubble. They would leave a place changed enough for people thousands of years later to still notice. One of the most striking things about vitrified forts is that the fire has outlived the story of the fire. The people who saw it happen may have known exactly what caused it. They may have spoken of it for generations. Perhaps there were songs, warnings, names, claims of victory, or memories of grief. But the words did not survive in a form we can trust. The stone did. That is the uneven bargain of history. Materials sometimes endure better than meaning. We inherit the burned wall, not the conversation around it. We can measure minerals, date charcoal, map ramparts, model temperatures, and compare sites. But the final human reason may remain just beyond reach. Not because it is supernatural, but because people are complicated, and most of them did not leave footnotes. There is also something deeply appropriate about this mystery belonging to hilltops. A hill fort is exposed to sky, wind, weather, and view. Fire on a hill is public. It is visible. If a fort burned intensely enough to vitrify its walls, the event would not have been hidden. It would have announced itself across the landscape. Flames would have lit the summit. Smoke would have marked the horizon. The heat may have roared through timber and stone while people watched from a distance, perhaps afraid, perhaps satisfied, perhaps silent. Later, when the flames died and the stones cooled, the wall would have looked different, darker, harder in places, broken in others, fused where it had once been built. The fort would have become both ruin and record. That is why Scotland's vitrified forts remain so useful for our broader journey. They show that ancient heat damage can look almost impossible while still having plausible explanations rooted in known materials and human practices. They warn us not to jump too quickly to the most extreme answer, but they also warn us not to dismiss the strangeness too quickly. These walls really did burn under impressive conditions. The heat really did alter stone. The question really is difficult. The mystery is not fake simply because some explanations are practical. Practical mysteries are often the best kind because they bring us closer to how people actually lived, built, fought, experimented and ended things. A wall that fused in a Scottish hill fort may not prove a lost civilization with advanced weapons, but it does prove that ancient societies could create or accidentally unleash heat intense enough to transform architecture into something geological. It also reminds us that ruins are not only shaped by slow decay. Sometimes they are shaped by sudden events. A long-built wall can change in one night. A defended place can become a furnace. A community's stronghold can become a glassy puzzle. And once that happens, the wall no longer belongs only to the people who built it. It belongs to geology, chemistry, weather, memory, and every later observer who comes along sees the fused stone and feels the old questions stir again. From these cold, wind-swept Scottish heights, the trail of heat does not fade. It moves southward, into older deserts and brighter stone, toward places where sand itself has turned to glass, where monuments have been scarred by temperature and time, and where Egypt's long memory gives the question of ancient fire a very different landscape to work upon. From the cold hilltops of Scotland, with their fused ramparts and stubborn winds, the trail of heat leads us toward a very different world. Egypt does not need much help feeling ancient. The country seems to carry age in its surface. Sand gathers in temple corners. Limestone blocks hold the marks of chisels, weather and hands long gone. Columns stand under a sun that has watched dynasties rise, argue, build, pray, tax grain, misplace officials, and eventually vanish into names carved on walls. If Scotland's vitrified forts feel like fire hidden inside stone, Egypt's mysteries often feel like fire spread across a landscape where the sun itself was part of religion, politics, daily labour, and cosmic order. Egypt is a useful place to slow down because it teaches us that not everything glassy is accidental, and not everything damaged by heat is mysterious in the same way. The ancient Egyptians were masters of materials that shine. They made faience, glass, pigments, glazes, beads, amulets, tiles, vessels and objects that still look wet with colour after thousands of years. They knew how to turn crushed quartz, salts, minerals, copper and heat into blue-green surfaces bright enough to suggest water, sky, fertility, rebirth and luxury. In the underground spaces of Djoser's Step Pyramid Complex at Saqqara, blue faience tiles once lined walls in a way that imitated reed matting from a royal palace. These were not the scars of destruction. They were deliberate surfaces, manufactured brilliance, heat used not as disaster, but as craft. That distinction matters because when people speak of glazed ruins in Egypt, several ideas can become tangled together. There are ancient objects deliberately glazed by skilled artisans. There are stones weathered by desert varnish or mineral staining. There are surfaces darkened by smoke, fire or salt. There are monuments damaged by later burning, reuse, erosion, and time. And far away in the western desert there is natural glass scattered across the sand, made by forces far older than Egypt's kings. All of these can look strange. All of them involve heat, chemistry, or surface change. But they do not all point to the same event. The past is not one big mystery drawer where every shiny thing belongs to the same missing key. It is more like an old workshop, full of tools, scraps, ashes, jars, labels that have fallen off, and something in the corner that may be important or may simply be a very old lump. The Egyptians themselves would have understood heat as a transformative power. You can see it in their crafts. Wet clay becomes pottery. Crushed minerals become colour. Powdery quartz becomes faience. Sand and flux become glass. Metal ores become tools, ornaments, and sacred objects. Fire could ruin, certainly, but it could also complete. It could make fragile things durable. It could turn dull ingredients into shine. It could create objects that seemed almost alive with colour. This is one reason we need to be careful when we see glaze or glass in an Egyptian context. Ancient Egypt was not a place where glassy surfaces automatically signal catastrophe. It was a place where people intentionally made glassy surfaces because they were beautiful, meaningful, and useful. Egyptian faience is especially important here. It is not ordinary pottery with a painted surface. It is a non-clay material, largely based on crushed quartz or sand, mixed with small amounts of lime and alkali. When fired, it can develop a glossy blue-green surface, often coloured by copper. The result is neither natural stone nor simple ceramic, but something in between, a human-made material that uses heat to imitate preciousness. It had associations with light, water, life, and renewal. It appears in amulets, beads, tiles, figurines, and objects placed with the dead. In a practical sense, it shows that ancient Egyptian workshops could control heat and chemical mixtures well enough to produce consistent effects. In a symbolic sense, it shows that glassy brightness mattered. The shine was not a mistake, it was the point. So when we imagine ancient Egypt and heat, we should not begin with destruction. We should begin with technology. Quiet technology, patient technology, the kind that leaves behind small objects in museum cases rather than dramatic craters. A faience amulet is not a melted wall, but it belongs to the same larger story of silica, flux, minerals, and fire. It reminds us that glass does not have to arrive from the sky. People can make it. People can coax it from powdered stone with recipes, furnaces, and practice, and when a civilization has worked with heat for centuries, it may leave behind surfaces that later viewers mistake for something more violent than manufacture. That does not make the craft less impressive. If anything, it makes it more impressive. A small blue tile made in an ancient workshop may not sound as dramatic as a meteor explosion, but try making one properly without modern equipment, and you may quickly develop a new respect for people who did this before electric ovens, temperature gauges, and customer service departments. Yet Egypt also contains the other side of the story, heat that no workshop made. Far west of the Nile, beyond the familiar ribbon of settlement, out in the great sand sea near the border region of Egypt and Libya, there are pieces of natural glass scattered across the desert. Libyan Desert glass, despite the name, is found in this wider region of the Eastern Sahara, including western Egypt. It is usually pale yellow, honey-coloured, sometimes greenish or cloudy, sometimes clear enough to catch light in a way that feels almost too delicate for the desert around it. It has been known to modern researchers for less than a century, but humans encountered and used it long before that. Stone Age people napped it into tools. Much later, a carved scarab made from this material became part of the jewellery associated with Tutankhamun. Imagine that for a moment. A pharaoh wearing, at the centre of a royal ornament, a piece of glass formed by a natural event nearly incomprehensible in scale and far older than his entire civilization. It is the kind of detail history gives us when it is in a generous mood. The formation of Libyan desert glass is not fully settled in every detail, but it clearly required extreme conditions. It is mostly silica-rich glass, and silica does not become glass across a desert landscape because someone lit a cooking fire and got carried away. For a long time, researchers have debated whether the glass formed from a meteorite impact at the surface, a powerful airburst in the atmosphere, or some related high-energy event. The absence of an obvious crater has helped keep the debate alive. A crater would be convenient, rather like a culprit leaving a signed note. But Earth is not always so tidy. Erosion, burial, and geological complexity can hide impact structures. Airbursts, by their nature, may leave destruction and melting without a classic bowl-shaped scar in the ground. The result is a material that seems to demand a cosmic explanation while refusing to provide every supporting detail neatly on request. Very inconsiderate, scientifically speaking. What makes the glass so important for our journey is that it proves the desert can preserve traces of heat far beyond ordinary human fire. Sand can become glass. Minerals can record violent conditions. A landscape can hold, in small scattered fragments, evidence of an ancient energy release that happened long before cities, temples, or kings. This is not a ruined wall, but it changes how we think about ruined walls. It reminds us that extreme heat events are real. They are not only the stuff of myths or dramatic theories. The Earth has been struck, scorched, blasted and reshaped by forces from beyond itself. Meteorites do fall, airbursts do happen, impact glasses do exist. The question is not whether cosmic violence is possible. The question is whether a particular ruin actually shows evidence for it. That difference is crucial. Libyan desert glass does not prove that Egyptian temples were melted by ancient weapons, or that vanished machines scorched monuments. It proves that natural forces can produce glass in the region under extreme conditions. It gives us a real example of high-energy transformation, not a license to explain every damaged stone by the same cause. This is where many stories about ancient mysteries become a little too enthusiastic. They find one dramatic phenomenon, then carry it around like a universal bottle opener. A glassy surface, cosmic blast, a broken statue, ancient superweapon, a darkened wall, lost technology, a suspiciously shiny pebble, probably Atlantis having a busy Tuesday. But evidence does not work that way. Each site needs its own context. Each material needs its own analysis. The desert glass tells one story, and the temples tell others. Still, it is understandable that Egypt attracts speculation. The scale of the monuments encourages it. The pyramids, obelisks, temples, colossi, and tombs can make modern observers feel that ordinary explanations are too small. Blocks weighing many tons were quarried, transported, raised, carved, and aligned with impressive skill. Granite was shaped. Limestone was cut. Hard stones were drilled and polished. Walls were covered with inscriptions. Whole landscapes were organised around temples, tombs, canals, quarries, settlements, and sacred routes. When people stand before such achievements, they sometimes reach for lost technologies because they have not spent enough time imagining what organised human labour, generations of craft knowledge, social hierarchy and religious motivation can accomplish. Ancient Egypt did not need impossible machinery to be astonishing. It was already astonishing with ropes, sledges, ramps, copper tools, stone pounders, skilled planning, and a bureaucracy that probably had more paperwork than anyone wants to think about before sleep. But there are real heat stories in Egyptian archaeology. Settlements burned, palaces suffered fires. Mud brick buildings collapsed in flames and baked into harder masses. Kilns fired pottery. Workshops produced glass, faience, metalwork and pigments. Later inhabitants reused ancient monuments, built fires near them, quarried them, burned limestone, cooked, camped and lived among ruins in ways that could leave marks. Temples were not sealed in perfect silence after their official use ended. Many were occupied, repurposed, damaged, repaired, stripped, smoked, buried and exposed again. A blackened ceiling in an Egyptian temple might be from ancient ritual activity, later habitation, oil lamps, Christian occupation, cooking fires, or centuries of human reuse. A damaged stone might result from salt crystallization, heat stress, quarrying, or weather. A glazed-looking patch may not be melted stone at all. It may be deposit, polish, varnish, or mineral alteration. Egypt is a place where time has not merely passed, it has layered itself. This is why the phrase heat of the gods can be both useful and misleading. Useful because Egyptians did connect the sun, fire, light, and divine power in ways that shape their art and architecture. The sun god Ra crossed the sky by day and the underworld by night. The desert was not just empty land, but a dangerous bright liminal space. Gold, light, and radiance carried sacred meanings. Blue-green faience could suggest rebirth and life. Fire transformed offerings and materials. Heat belonged to both daily craft and cosmic order. But misleading, because the religious language can tempt us into treating physical damage as proof of divine or supernatural destruction. Ancient people may have interpreted catastrophe through gods, but modern analysis has to look at minerals, layers, tools, fuel, and dating. A myth may preserve memory. It may also reshape memory beyond recognition. It can point toward an event, or away from one, or towards something emotional rather than geological. Myths are valuable, but they do not come with laboratory results tucked politely into the margins. The desert itself adds another kind of glaze to the story. In dry landscapes, rock surfaces can develop dark coatings known as desert varnish, made over long periods by clays, oxides, and microbial activity. These surfaces can appear polished, stained, or glazed. They are not melted by sudden heat. They are weathered by time, chemistry, and exposure. To an untrained eye, they can look artificial or burned. This is another reminder that surfaces can deceive us. A wall or stone may appear scorched when it is chemically stained. Another may appear naturally weathered when it was actually heated. The eye begins the investigation, but it cannot finish it. We need context, testing, comparison, and patience. The past has had thousands of years to become confusing. It is only fair that we take more than a glance before deciding what happened. There are also stories around certain Egyptian ruins that speak of melted or vitrified stone, but many of these claims are difficult to verify. Photographs circulate, descriptions repeat. A temple wall looks glazed, a stone appears blackened, a block seems melted. But without excavation records, laboratory analysis and clear context, such claims remain suggestive rather than firm. This does not mean they should always be ignored. Sometimes unusual observations lead to important questions, but it does mean we should avoid turning every dramatic image into evidence of a forgotten disaster. A close-up photograph can hide scale. Lighting can exaggerate gloss. Modern restoration materials can alter surfaces. Smoke can darken stone. Salt can blister it. Polishing by hands, wind, sand, or water can make it shine. A mystery that begins with a photograph should remain a question until the stone itself has been studied properly. The camera is a helpful tool, but it is also a talented mischief maker. Egypt's quarries provide another angle. Ancient workers extracted hard stones like granite, especially from places such as Aswan. The unfinished obelisk there shows the scale and technique of quarry work, with tool marks and stone channels still visible. Some alternative theories have suggested heat, advanced cutting, or unusual energy methods to explain ancient stonework. But much of the evidence points to persistent mechanical labour. pounding stones, chisels, abrasives, wedges, water, leverage, sledges, and repeated effort. Heat may have played roles in some quarrying traditions elsewhere in the world, such as fire setting to fracture rock, but for Egyptian monumental stonework, the clearest evidence is often patient tooling rather than melted surfaces. This is important because impressive stone shaping does not automatically equal stone melting. Cutting, polishing, drilling, and transporting are different problems from vitrifying. Each deserves its own explanation. Otherwise, we risk tossing every hard ancient task into one basket labelled mystery, then wondering why the basket has become too heavy to lift. The more we look, the more Egypt becomes a landscape of controlled heat and uncontrolled heat, deliberate shine and natural glass, craft and catastrophe, myth and mineral. On one side, faience tiles under a pyramid show artisans using fire to create a royal illusion of palace walls, blue and green, cool-looking despite being born in heat. On another side, desert glass shows nature using unimaginable energy to turn sand into fragments later prized by humans. Between these poles lie burned settlements, smoked chambers, damaged stones, fired bricks, kilns, workshops, and ruins altered by centuries of reuse. It is not a single story of melted monuments. It is a whole family of heat stories, some human, some natural, some certain, some debated, some exaggerated, and some still waiting for better evidence. The interesting thing is that ancient Egyptians themselves lived between the Nile and the desert, between water and heat. The Nile Valley was fertile, ordered, cultivated, measured. The desert was bright, dry, dangerous, and full of stone. Egyptian civilization depended on controlling that contrast. Irrigation, calendars, fields, storehouses, temples, tombs, and rituals all worked against the threat of disorder. The sun gave life, but too much heat meant death. The desert preserved bodies, but it also swallowed settlements. Fire made offerings and objects, but fire could destroy houses and archives. So when we talk about heat in Egypt, we are not bringing an outside theme to the place. We are touching something deeply built into its environment and worldview. Egypt was always negotiating with heat. This may be why the idea of a sudden cosmic event in the region feels so powerful. A glass formed in the desert by impact or airburst seems almost like a geological echo of Egyptian religious imagery, though it predates the religion by millions of years. A flash from the sky, sand changed to glass, a material later worn by a king. It is not hard to see why people are drawn to that connection, but we should not mistake poetic connection for historical cause. Tutankhamun did not know the geological origin of the scarab material in modern scientific terms. The glass was valuable because it was rare, beautiful, and workable, not because someone had a written report on impact physics. Still, the chain is remarkable. A cosmic or impact-related event creates glass. The desert preserves it. Humans find it. Craftsmen shape it. A king wears it. Archaeologists discover it. Scientists analyze it. And now, much later, someone listening in bed thinks, quite reasonably, well, that is a bit odd, and pulls the blanket slightly higher. There is a quiet lesson here for the wider mystery of melted ruins. Extreme heat can be natural. Extreme heat can be technological. Glaze can be intentional. Glass can be accidental. Stone can be damaged without being melted. A surface can appear mysterious because we do not yet know enough about its context. Egypt gives us examples of all these possibilities. It refuses the easy answer, which is inconvenient but useful. It says, in effect, do not ask only whether something looks melted. Ask what it is made of. Ask where it was found. Ask whether people nearby were making glass, firing pottery, burning lime, or living in the ruin centuries later. Ask whether the material is local, whether the heat was ancient, whether the layer is sealed, whether the chemistry fits an impact, a kiln, a hearth, a workshop, or whether. Ask whether the story has grown larger than the evidence, as stories often do when left unattended. And yet, after all the caution, the wonder remains. It remains in the blue faience tiles beneath Djoser's pyramid, where ancient workers turned crushed minerals into gleaming surfaces meant to evoke royal life and renewal. It remains in the yellow desert glass lying across remote sands, a natural material born from heat so fierce that even today scientists debate the exact violence of its making. It remains in blackened walls, fired bricks, kiln debris, and ruined chambers where human fire left its mark. Egypt does not give us one melted city or one simple furnace-struck monument. It gives us a spectrum from workshop fire to cosmic heat, from sacred craft to geological accident. That spectrum is far more interesting than a single answer. As the trail moves onward, away from the Nile and the Western Desert, it carries with it this lesson. Before we call a stone impossible, we must understand the hands that shaped it and the forces that could alter it. Before we imagine a lost machine, we must first give ancient craft its due. Before we dismiss a strange glass as ordinary, we must remember that the sky has touched the earth with violence many times before. Egypt leaves us with both restraint and possibility. It asks us to hold them together carefully, like a fragile object with a bright glazed surface, while the path turns toward the mountains and highlands of Peru, where another kind of stone mystery waits in walls so tight, so complex, and so strangely fitted that people have wondered whether the stones themselves were ever softened, shaped, or persuaded into place by techniques we have not yet fully recovered. From Egypt's desert glass and deliberate blue-green glazes, the trail of heat and stone takes us across the ocean and up into the Andes, where the question changes shape. In Scotland, we were looking at walls that appear burned from within. In Egypt, we saw how heat could be both craft and catastrophe, workshop and sky event. But in Peru, especially around the Great Inca and pre-Inca landscapes of the highlands, the mystery is less often a wall that looks scorched, and more often a wall that looks impossible in its fit. The stones do not always look melted in the way a piece of glass does. They do not usually sit there with black bubbles and slag-like seams. Instead, they press against one another so closely, so irregularly, and with such confidence that many people have looked at them and wondered whether the builder somehow softened the stone itself, shaped it like clay, and let it harden again in place. It is a strange idea, certainly, but when you stand before some of these walls, it is easy to understand why the thought first entered someone's mind. The most famous example is Sacsayhuaman, the great site overlooking Cuzco. It sits above the city on a hill, massive and quiet, with its zigzag walls running in great angular lines across the slope. The stones are not small blocks politely stacked like bricks. Some are enormous, weighing many tons, shaped into irregular polygons and fitted without mortar. The joints can be so tight that a knife blade cannot easily enter. Some blocks have many sides, each meeting neighbours at different angles. The result is not a simple wall. It is more like a three-dimensional puzzle built from boulders, except the puzzle pieces are taller than people, heavier than carts, and not the sort of thing you would want to find missing one corner after opening the box. This kind of masonry has a powerful effect on the imagination because it looks both natural and artificial at once. The stones are irregular, almost organic in outline, yet the fit is deliberate. They do not form neat horizontal rows in the familiar way of cut masonry. They interlock, they brace each other. They seem to grip the wall through shape as much as weight. In a place of earthquakes, that matters. A rigid wall with brittle mortar can crack and collapse when the ground moves. A dry stone wall, if built well, can absorb movement differently. Its pieces can shift slightly, settle and continue holding. This does not mean every Inca wall is magically earthquake-proof, a phrase that sounds impressive but can be misleading. Many structures have collapsed, been robbed, rebuilt, damaged, or repaired over time. But the surviving high-status walls of Cusco and nearby sites show that Andean builders understood stability in a seismic landscape with remarkable skill. The softened stone idea usually begins with the joints. How could such large, oddly shaped stones fit so closely without modern tools? How could builders cut curves, recesses, projections, and contact surfaces so precisely? Why do some stones appear to bulge slightly, as if they were pressed together while pliable? Why do certain surfaces seem smoothed, rounded, or almost moulded? These observations have inspired claims of lost chemistry, plant extracts that softened rock, ancient heat treatment, unknown acids, sonic tools, or technologies inherited from a much older civilization. Some versions are gentle speculation, others sprint straight into ancient supermachinery with the enthusiasm of a dog spotting an open gate. But the core question is reasonable, the work is difficult, the visual effect is unusual. A good mystery does not require us to accept every wild answer, only to admit that the question deserves time. There are traditional stories and later reports about plants that could soften stone, though these are difficult to verify scientifically. Such stories often appear in discussions of Andean masonry because they offer a simple and appealing explanation. If the stone could be softened, then the joints make immediate sense. Workers would not need to carve every surface with exhausting precision. They could press, shape, and adjust the stone more like clay. The problem is that hard evidence for this technique is lacking. Rocks like the limestone, diorite, andesite, or other stones used in Andean building do not simply soften under a mild plant juice in a way that lets them be moulded and then rehardened like pottery. Chemical weathering can alter stone, acids can attack some minerals, heat can crack, weaken, or transform materials. But turning huge construction stones into workable putty, then setting them permanently into architectural blocks, would leave signs that should be detectable. So far, the mainstream evidence points not to stone softened like dough, but to skilled quarrying, shaping, fitting, abrasion, and immense labour. That may sound less exciting at first. It should not. Skilled labour is not a boring explanation when the labour is this good. There is a habit in modern mystery culture of treating human effort as a disappointment, as though saying, "People did this with tools and patience," somehow makes the achievement smaller. But it does the opposite. It brings the achievement back into human hands. It asks us to imagine teams of workers selecting stone, roughing it out at the quarry, moving it over uneven ground, raising it, lowering it, checking the fit, removing high points, smoothing contact areas, shifting it again, and repeating the process until the block sat where it belonged. This was not casual work. It required organisation, authority, skill, food supply, engineering judgment, and a society able to direct labour toward monumental goals. The absence of modern machinery does not imply the absence of technology. A rope is technology, a lever is technology, a plumb line is technology, a trained eye is technology. A foreman who knows exactly when someone is pretending not to hear instructions is also, in a certain sense, technology. One possible method for close fitting is scribing, a technique familiar in carpentry and stonework. The idea is to transfer the shape of one surface onto another, so that the second can be cut to match. If you have ever watched a craftsperson fit wood against an uneven wall, you may have seen this in a simple form. They trace the contour, cut along it, test, adjust, and slowly the pieces meet. With stones, especially huge stones, this becomes far more difficult, but the principle remains. A block could be placed near its intended position, the contact surfaces marked or measured, then removed or adjusted for further dressing. It may not need to be lifted and replaced endlessly if the builders use clever marking systems, templates, cords, clay, pigments, plumb bobs, or reference points. We do not know every detail of their method, and different walls may have used different approaches, but a careful fitting process explains a great deal without requiring the stone to become soft. Abrasives also matter. Hard stone can be shaped by harder stone, by pounding, grinding, and rubbing with sand or other abrasive materials. This is slow, but slow is not impossible. Many ancient technologies depend on repetition rather than speed. A copper tool may not cut granite like modern steel, but stone pounders and abrasives can remove material. The surface does not need to be sliced cleanly in one motion. It can be pecked, bruised, ground, and polished. The builders could create flat or curved contact zones one small correction at a time. This kind of work leaves marks, and in many ancient stoneworking traditions, tool marks and unfinished stones show stages of production. Finished walls hide the labour precisely because they are finished. The better the work, the more mysterious it becomes. A rough quarry face looks human. A perfect joint looks supernatural. That is the unfairness of craftsmanship. When it succeeds completely, people assume nobody could have done it. There is also an important difference between the visible front face of a stone and the hidden contact surfaces behind it. A wall may look as if every inch of every block was perfectly shaped. In reality, only certain contact areas need to fit tightly. The visible seams can be extremely fine, while deeper internal spaces may be packed, adjusted, or less regular. That does not diminish the achievement. It simply makes it more practical. Ancient builders were not trying to impress future tourists with impossible hidden geometry. They were building walls that needed to stand, display power, and fit within the labour and materials available. A huge block might be carefully dressed along the face and joints, while the back remained rougher. The wall's appearance gives us only part of the story, rather like seeing someone dressed neatly from the waist up on a video call and wisely not asking too much about the rest. The famous bulging look of some Andean stones also has possible practical explanations. A slightly convex face can shed water, resist edge damage, and create a strong visual surface. Rounded edges may come from deliberate dressing, later weathering, polishing by touch, or the removal of fragile corners. Stones can look moulded because their surfaces were carefully worked into smooth flowing shapes. Human hands are perfectly capable of making hard materials appear soft. Sculptors do it all the time. A marble statue can look like skin, fabric, hair, or muscle, though it remains stone. The question is not whether stone can be made to look soft. It can. The question is whether it was actually softened. And for Peru's great masonry, the evidence for actual softening remains weak compared with the evidence for skilled shaping. This does not mean the walls are easy to explain in a casual way. They are not. Moving stones weighing many tons at high altitude is hard. Cutting them to fit irregular neighbours is hard. Organising the labour is hard. Building in earthquake country is hard. Doing all of that at monumental scale, and doing it well enough that people centuries later still argue about how it was possible, is a genuine achievement. It may also reflect inherited traditions. The Inca did not appear in a cultural vacuum. The Andes had long histories of stonework, ceremonial centres, roads, terraces, irrigation, and social organisation before the Inca Empire expanded. Earlier cultures developed techniques, ideas, and sacred relationships with landscape and stone. The Inca absorbed, adapted, and intensified many traditions. So when we look at Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, Machu Picchu, Cusco walls, or other sites, we are not looking at a single burst of genius from nowhere. We are looking at a long Andean history of building, memory, labour, and landscape knowledge condensed into stone. Ollantaytambo is especially useful here because it shows the problem of transport and placement as well as fitting. Large stones were quarried from the opposite side of a valley and moved across difficult terrain to the site. Some stones, often called tired stones, still lie along the route, as if the project paused and never fully resumed. Their presence helps ground the mystery. They are not melted, they are not levitated. They are abandoned blocks in the landscape, evidence of real movement, real difficulty, and real human process. They show that the builders attempted extremely demanding transport tasks using methods that were physical, organised, and probably slow. The stones were not simply conjured into place. They were dragged, guided, perhaps rolled over prepared paths, moved with ropes, ramps and teams, and placed through effort that would make most modern gym memberships look a little unserious. Machu Picchu offers a different lesson. It is often admired for its elegant masonry and dramatic setting, but much of its genius lies in water management, terraces, drainage, and adaptation to a steep mountain environment. The fine stonework gets the photographs, and understandably so, but the survival of such a site depends as much on what happens underfoot and behind walls as on what appears in front of visitors. Drainage channels, foundations, terraces, and carefully managed slopes are not flashy in the way huge polygonal blocks are, but they show practical intelligence. Ancient architecture is often most impressive where it is least theatrical. The wall that dazzles you may owe its survival to a drain you barely noticed. History, like a well-built house, depends on things hidden behind the attractive surfaces. So where does heat enter Peru's puzzle? Claims of vitrified or fused stones in Peru do exist, especially around discussions of Sacsayhuaman and related sites. Some observers point to shiny patches, smooth surfaces, unusual discoloration, or stones that appear melted. These claims need careful separation. A polished stone surface is not the same as a vitrified melt. Weathering, mineral coatings, handling, lichen removal, restoration, camera lighting, and the natural texture of certain rocks can all create effects that look unusual. Some stones may show evidence of heating from later fires, lightning, or local activity. But isolated surface changes do not prove a site-wide melting technology. To establish actual vitrification, researchers would need material analysis showing that minerals melted and cooled as glass, along with context proving when and how it happened. Without that, the word vitrified can become more of a visual impression than a scientific conclusion. It is worth remembering how powerful visual impressions can be. A stone surface catches sunlight at an angle. It looks glossy. A joint curves smoothly. It looks moulded. A block bulges. It looks swollen. A line between stones is so tight it looks fused. The eye reaches for analogies from daily life. Clay, wax, glass, poured material. That is natural. The brain explains unfamiliar things by comparing them with familiar ones. But stoneworking can produce forms that resemble softness without involving melting. A polished granite countertop is hard, but it shines. A carved stone basin can curve like something poured. A weathered boulder can look melted after centuries of water and wind. Appearance begins curiosity, but it cannot carry the whole argument by itself. The idea of lost advanced technology is not entirely separate from a real historical issue. We have lost many practical techniques, not because they were supernatural, but because skills disappear when the social systems that maintain them disappear. A method passed from master to apprentice may never be written down. A construction system may depend on tools made of perishable materials. A quarrying route may vanish under vegetation or urban growth. A measuring method may be embedded in gestures, chords, chants, counting systems, or work habits that colonial disruption erased. When empires fall and communities are broken, knowledge can be lost not dramatically in one burning library, but quietly, person by person. So it is reasonable to say we may not fully know how every Andean wall was made. It is not reasonable to jump from that uncertainty directly to stone-melting rays. Between ignorance and impossibility lies a very large country, and archaeology spends much of its life walking through it with a notebook. There is also a social reason these walls are so precise. In the Inca world, stonework was not merely construction. It expressed power. Fine masonry was associated with high-status buildings, religious sites, royal spaces, and imperial presence. A wall in Cusco could communicate order, control, and sacred legitimacy. The fitting of stones without mortar may have carried meaning beyond engineering. It showed command over labour and material. It connected architecture to mountains, ancestors, and the organised body of the empire. To us, A perfect joint may look like a technical puzzle. To the people who built and used it, it may also have been political, sacred, and aesthetic. The difficulty was part of the message. It said, "This place matters enough for this much work." That's not so different from cathedrals, pyramids, palaces, or modern government buildings that use costly materials to say, politely but firmly, "Please be impressed." When people imagine a lost prehistoric civilization behind Andean masonry, they're often responding to that feeling of scale. The walls seem older than explanation, even when many belong clearly to known Inca contexts. Some suggest that the Inca inherited megalithic walls from a much earlier vanished culture and simply built on top of them. In some places, earlier occupations and pre-Inca influences are real, and Andean history is certainly deeper than the Inca Empire alone. But broad claims of a lost global civilization responsible for all impressive stonework across the world tend to flatten local histories. They take Egyptian, Andean, Mesopotamian, European and Asian achievements and pour them into one speculative mould. That can feel exciting, but it risks erasing the specific people who actually built, repaired, worshipped, governed, and lived in these places. The stones of Peru do not need to be borrowed from Atlantis to matter. They already belong to the Andes. Even so, there remains a legitimate puzzle of technique. How exactly were the larger stones adjusted? How were templates used? How many people were involved? How long did it take? How were surfaces checked? How were stones lifted for final placement? How did workers coordinate without modern cranes? These are good questions. They are better than simply asking whether aliens, lasers, or ancient acids were involved, because they lead us toward testable ideas. Experimental archaeology can try methods. Tool marks can be studied. Quarries can be mapped. Routes can be reconstructed. Wear patterns can be examined. Ethno-historical sources can be compared carefully. The mystery becomes richer when we ask specific practical questions instead of one enormous question with a dramatic answer already attached. The fused impression in Peru may also come from the way stones meet visually. In mortarless masonry, there is no soft filler line between blocks. The stones themselves form the joint. When the fit is extremely tight, the wall can seem almost continuous, as if separate stones had grown together. This is not true fusion in a chemical sense. It is visual fusion, architectural fusion, the joining of pieces so precise that separation becomes difficult to imagine. In some places, the joints curve and turn around corners of blocks, giving the impression that the stones were pressed together while soft. But a tight mechanical fit can produce that effect. The wall is not melted, it is persuaded. And persuasion, when done with enough skill and enough labour, can look very much like magic from a distance. There is a quiet irony here. In Scotland, the walls appear fused because they were damaged by heat. In Peru, some walls appear fused because they were built too well. One is the trace of fire, the other is the trace of fit. Both can be mistaken for melting if we're not careful, but they tell different stories. The Scottish vitrified forts ask how a wall burned. The Peruvian masonry asks how a wall was made. The first mystery begins with destruction. The second begins with construction. And yet both lead us to the same wider theme. Stone is not as simple as it seems. It can burn, crack, melt, polish, shift, interlock, and carry human intention across centuries. Standing before the walls of el-Hammam, it is possible to feel two things at once. First, the temptation of the impossible. The stones are huge, the joints are fine, the angles are strange. Some surfaces seem almost too smooth, too rounded, too fitted to belong to hand tools and patient labour. Second, the evidence of human work. The quarrying, transport, shaping, planning and placement all belong to a world of bodies, ropes, stone tools, organisation and practice. The wall is not less wonderful because people made it. It is more wonderful. It means that human beings, working in a highland empire without wheels for transport in the way Eurasian societies used them, without iron tools and without modern cranes, still produced architecture that unsettles our confidence. It is a reminder that technology is not one straight ladder leading to us at the top. It is many branches, each adapted to a place, a culture, a problem, and a way of seeing the world. Perhaps the best way to approach Peru's impossible masonry is not to ask whether the stones were melted, but why they look as though they might have been. That question keeps the mystery alive without surrendering it to fantasy. They look softened because their surfaces were shaped with care. They look fused because the joints are tight. They look beyond ordinary masonry because they are beyond ordinary masonry. They represent an exceptional tradition of stone building, not impossible, not fully explained in every practical detail, not evidence by itself of lost rays or forgotten machines, but extraordinary enough that people keep wondering, and that wondering has value when it leads us back to the stones themselves. And so Peru gives our journey a different kind of heat. Not necessarily the heat of a burning wall or a desert airburst, but the heat of human effort, of stone dressed under sun, of bodies working at altitude, of surfaces ground and checked again, of imperial ambition pressed into the joints between blocks. It also gives us a warning. Some mysteries are born from destruction, but others are born from skill. A wall can look impossible, not because it was made by impossible means, but because the people who made it were better at their work than we first allowed ourselves to imagine. From here, the question of sudden destruction returns in a sharper form, as we move away from fitted stones and toward a settlement where some researchers have argued that the sky itself may have delivered heat, pressure, and ruin in a single catastrophic event. From the fitted stones of Peru, where the mystery sits in precision and patience, we come now to a very different kind of question. Not how did people build this, but what could have ended it so suddenly. Tall el-Hammam sits in the southern Jordan Valley northeast of the Dead Sea in a landscape where heat, salt, water and memory all seem to press close together. It is not a lonely ruin on a Scottish hill or a bright desert glass field far from settlement. It is the remains of a large Bronze Age city, a place that once had walls, gates, houses, rooms, storage, movement, noise, meals, arguments, animals, children, trade, and all the ordinary human clutter that makes a city feel alive. Then, at some point in the Middle Bronze Age, it was destroyed. That much is not the most controversial part. The controversy begins with the nature of the destruction, because some researchers have argued that Tall el-Hammam was not merely burned by war, accident, or ordinary urban fire, but struck by something from the sky. The idea is dramatic, and it needs to be held gently. According to the airburst proposal, a cosmic body entered the atmosphere and exploded above the region, creating a flash of heat, a powerful pressure wave, intense winds, and destruction over a wide area. The comparison often made is Tunguska, the 1908 event in Siberia, where an object from space exploded in the atmosphere and flattened a vast area of forest without leaving a classic impact crater. A city under something like that would have had almost no time to understand what was happening. There would be no army visible at the gates, no long siege, no slow creeping fire from house to house, no warning except perhaps a sudden light, a roar, heat, and then force. It is the sort of event that feels almost too modern in its violence, like a natural disaster wearing the clothes of a weapon. And that is why it has captured so much attention. But before we let the imagination run too far ahead, perhaps with its shoes half tied and a torch in one hand, it is worth slowing down. Tall el-Hammam is a real archaeological site. It has real destruction layers. There are claims of unusual materials, heat-damaged pottery, melted fragments, shocked minerals, spherules, and signs of high-temperature processes. There are also serious criticisms of those claims. Other scientists have argued that the mineral evidence was misread, the geochemical interpretation was weak, and the comparisons with Tunguska were not reliable enough. The original airburst paper was eventually retracted, which does not mean the city was never destroyed, and does not mean every observation at the site is meaningless. It means that the specific claim that a cosmic airburst destroyed the city was judged not sufficiently supported by the evidence as presented. This is important. A mystery does not disappear when one explanation weakens. It simply becomes a mystery again, which is both frustrating and, in a quiet way, honest. Tall el-Hammam matters for this journey because it sits right on the boundary between evidence, interpretation, memory, and myth. It is the kind of place where a burned layer can become a scientific debate, where a collapsed city can become a possible sky event, and where ancient destruction can attract comparisons with stories of fire from above. Some have connected the site to the biblical story of Sodom, though that connection is deeply debated and not necessary for the scientific question. The geological and archaeological issue can be asked without deciding whether any ancient text preserves a memory of it. What happened to the city? How hot did it get? Was the damage consistent with warfare, earthquake, fire, salt effects, collapse, or something more unusual? These are material questions first. The stories come later, carrying their own weight, their own meanings, and sometimes their own complications, like guests at dinner who bring too many opinions and no dessert. Imagine the city before its destruction, not as a pile of mud, brick and ash, but as a living place. Streets and rooms, courtyards, storage jars, people moving between buildings, smoke from cooking fires, walls repaired after wear, children running where excavators would one day measure layers, animals penned nearby, pottery vessels used, broken, discarded, replaced. In the Bronze Age Jordan Valley, a large fortified city would have been a major presence. It would have controlled land, water, trade routes, labour and status. Its walls were not decoration. They were power made visible, and yet walls, as we have already seen, can be very convincing right up until the moment a force arrives that does not care about walls. If the airburst idea were correct, the destruction would have been unlike an ordinary siege. A meteor airburst does not attack from the side. It arrives from above and releases energy into the atmosphere. Heat radiation can ignite exposed materials. A pressure wave can shatter structures. Winds can tear across the ground. Dust and debris can be thrown into the air. In such an event, the damage pattern might be broad, rapid, and confusing. Mud brick walls could collapse, roofs could fail, pottery could break, burn, or perhaps partially melt under extreme conditions. Human remains, if present, could be scattered or fragmented by force and collapse. The whole event might last seconds, while its aftermath would remain for thousands of years. That contrast is unsettling. A few seconds of physics, followed by millennia of archaeology. This is one reason the proposal felt so powerful when it appeared. It offered a single event that seemed to explain heat, destruction, abandonment, and perhaps even later memory. It fit neatly, almost too neatly. A flash from the sky, a city burned, a region changed, a story preserved. Humans like explanations that have shape. We like a beginning, a middle, and an impact, preferably one that comes with a dramatic sound effect. But science has to ask whether the shape was drawn by the evidence or by the storyteller. Did the materials truly require airburst temperatures? Were the supposed shocked grains actually shocked in the right way? Could the spherules have formed by other processes? Were the melted materials securely tied to the destruction event? Were the comparisons to known impact sites fair? Were the measurements reliable? A spectacular theory can still fail if the details do not hold. That may sound like cold water poured over a glowing mystery, but it is really the opposite. Careful criticism keeps the mystery from being cheapened. If every strange burn mark becomes proof of a cosmic blast, then none of them teach us very much. The value of Tall el-Hammam is not that it gives us an easy answer. It is that it shows how difficult these questions become when ancient destruction is severe. Evidence is fragmentary, and the proposed cause is rare. An ordinary city fire is easy to imagine but may not explain everything. A cosmic airburst is exciting but requires very strong evidence. Warfare is common but may leave different signatures. Earthquake damage can collapse walls but does not usually melt material. Salt and heat in the Dead Sea region can alter surfaces in unusual ways. Later activity can disturb layers. Each explanation can account for part of the scene. The challenge is deciding which one accounts for the whole scene best, without stretching it beyond its evidence like a very tired piece of elastic. The Jordan Valley itself adds complexity. This is not a neutral laboratory. It is a dynamic landscape, shaped by the Dead Sea transform fault system, by earthquakes, by changing water availability, by salt, by climate, by long histories of occupation and abandonment. Mud brick cities in such environments can suffer dramatic damage without anything falling from space. Earthquakes can topple walls, fires can spread through dense settlement, salts can affect materials. Political collapse, warfare, drought, and trade shifts can empty cities. Archaeological destruction is often not one thing, it can be a chain. A quake weakens buildings, fire follows, people flee. Later weather erodes exposed walls. Later inhabitants dig, reuse, and disturb. Thousands of years later, a layer can look sudden even if the process was more complicated, like waking up to a messy kitchen and blaming one person, when in fact everyone contributed quietly over several hours. Still, the airburst remains worth discussing because airbursts are real natural events. Tunguska was real. The Chelyabinsk meteor in 2013 was real, much smaller but still strong enough to damage buildings and injure people with shattered glass. Earth moves through a sky that contains objects, and sometimes those objects arrive. Most burn up harmlessly, some do not. A large enough airburst over a settled area would be devastating. The ancient world had no warning system, no telescope surveys, no atmospheric models, no emergency alerts buzzing rudely on a bedside table. If a city experienced such an event, its people might interpret it as divine wrath, a star falling, heavenly fire, or something beyond language. Later generations might preserve it as myth, reshape it into moral story, or forget it entirely. The possibility is not absurd, it is simply hard to prove. The word may is therefore doing a great deal of work in the phrase, the skyburst that may have burned a city. It keeps the door open without pretending the room beyond is fully mapped. May does not mean did. It means there is a question, a proposal, an argument, and a debate. That is a healthier way to tell this story. The site may have been destroyed by a cosmic airburst, but the published case for that has been seriously challenged. It may instead have suffered a violent fire, warfare, earthquake, or combination of processes. It may preserve some high-temperature materials, but their origin may be more ordinary or more complex than first claimed. It may have inspired later stories, but that is much harder to demonstrate than simply finding a burned layer. In archaeology, may is often the most honest word in the room. It does not shine as brightly as certainly, but it is less likely to trip over the furniture. One of the most interesting parts of the Tall el-Hammam debate is the question of melted pottery and mud brick. Pottery already begins as fired material. It has passed through heat before. But over-fired pottery, warped pottery, melted surfaces, and vitrified clay can indicate temperatures higher than those of typical use or destruction fires. Mud brick, made of clay-rich earth, straw, and other materials, can bake hard in a fire and sometimes become almost ceramic. In severe building fires, mud brick walls can redden, harden, crack, and slump. If temperatures rise high enough, parts can vitrify. The important question is whether the materials at Tall el-Hammam require an extremely brief, extremely hot atmospheric blast, or whether they could form in localized fires, burning buildings, kilns, industrial contexts, or post-depositional processes. That is not a question that I alone can answer. It needs laboratory work, context, and comparison. Shocked quartz is another key issue in impact claims. Under high pressure, quartz grains can develop microscopic deformation features associated with impacts. If genuine and properly identified, shocked quartz can be powerful evidence. But not every damaged quartz grain is shocked quartz in the impact sense. Grains can be fractured, scratched, strained, or altered by many processes. Misidentification can lead to big conclusions resting on tiny lines under a microscope. There is something almost comical about that, if it were not so important. A whole city's dramatic proposed ending may depend on whether a microscopic feature in a mineral grain was read correctly. History sometimes turns on emperors and armies. Sometimes it turns on a tiny scratch in a crystal saying, "Excuse me, I may not mean what you think I mean." Spherules also sound impressive because they are associated with high-temperature processes. Tiny rounded particles can form when material melts and cools in droplets. They are found in some impact contexts, but they can also form from volcanic processes, industrial contamination, fires, lightning, and other high-temperature events. Their composition and context matter. Finding small melted particles is not automatically the same as finding an airburst. Again, the evidence must be read carefully. What are they made of? Are they in a sealed ancient layer? Are they widespread? Do they match local materials? Could they come from later activity? Are they similar to particles at confirmed impact sites in ways that matter, or only in ways that sound similar in a paragraph? Archaeology and geology both have a talent for punishing vague comparisons. The retraction of the original airburst paper makes this section unusual for a sleep documentary, because it asks us to sit with uncertainty in real time. Not ancient uncertainty alone, but modern scientific uncertainty, a claim was made. Other experts challenged it. Editors withdrew confidence. The debate continued in other forms. That is not a failure of science. It is part of the process, though it can look untidy from outside. Science is often presented as a sequence of clean discoveries, like stepping stones across a stream. In reality, it is more like a group of people building the stepping stones while arguing about the water level, the shape of the rocks, and whether someone has brought enough tea. Claims are tested. Some survive. Some weaken. Some change. Some are withdrawn. The result, ideally, is not a loss of wonder, but a better kind of wonder, one that knows how to wait. For storytelling, Tall el-Hammam is tempting because it offers a scene that is easy to imagine. A city under bright sky. A sudden flash, heat, shock, walls collapsing, pottery cracking, people thrown into confusion, silence afterward. The visual power is undeniable. But the responsible version of the story has to keep another image beside it. Scientists examining samples, arguing over mineral features, comparing data, questioning assumptions and saying, "Not so fast." Both images belong. The first is what might have happened if the airburst idea is correct. The second is what has happened in the attempt to prove it. The ancient event is uncertain. The modern debate is real. This does not make Tall el-Hammam less useful for the larger question of melted ruins. In fact, it may make it more useful. It shows us how a site can become a meeting place for archaeology, planetary science, biblical studies, geology, chemistry, media excitement, public fascination, and scholarly criticism. Everyone arrives with different questions. The archaeologist asks about layers, pottery, walls, and occupation. The geologist asks about minerals, pressure, heat, and formation processes. The planetary scientist asks whether the signatures match known airbursts or impacts. The historian asks what later texts can and cannot say. The public asks whether this is evidence of fire from heaven, lost catastrophe, or history more dramatic than textbooks allowed. The site stands in the middle, saying nothing while everyone leans in. If we pull back from the controversy, the deeper theme is fragility. A city can seem permanent. Its walls can be thick, Its gates can be strong. Its people can have routines so familiar that tomorrow feels guaranteed. Then something changes. War, earthquake, drought, fire, political collapse, or perhaps, rarely, a force from the sky. The city ends, but not completely. A ruin remains. A layer remains. A scatter of broken objects remains. The ending becomes part of the ground. Thousands of years later, people return with brushes, measuring tools, microscopes, and theories. They try to reconstruct the last day from what survived the first night afterward. That is a humble task. It requires imagination, but it also requires restraint. The airburst proposal, even in its challenged form, also reminds us that ancient people lived under the same sky we do. We sometimes imagine cosmic hazards as modern scientific concerns because we now have satellites, telescopes, simulations, and dramatic movie trailers. But the sky was always there. A Bronze Age farmer, priest, trader, potter, or child stood beneath the same stream of meteors, the same wandering stones, the same unpredictable atmosphere. Most nights brought stars. Rare moments brought fire. If a large enough object exploded above a settlement, the experience would have been so far outside daily categories that memory might turn it into theology or legend. It would not be described as an airburst. It might be described as a burning wind, a judgment, a star, a god, a curse, or the end of the world. Modern science can translate some ancient events into physics, but it must first prove the event existed. There is a quiet caution here for every ancient catastrophe theory. Similarity is not identity. A story of fire from above resembles an airburst. A burned city resembles a destroyed city. Melted pottery resembles high-temperature catastrophe. But resemblance is the beginning of inquiry, not the end. Many different causes can produce similar-looking traces. Fire can mimic catastrophe. Catastrophe can leave traces that look like fire. Myths can preserve events or create patterns of meaning unrelated to physical history. A city can be destroyed suddenly and still not be destroyed from the sky. A sky event can happen and leave little archaeological trace if no city stood beneath it. The world is full of near misses, false matches, and half-preserved clues. Very inconsiderate again, but also very human in its messiness. So what do we do with Tall el-Hammam? We neither crown it as proven cosmic destruction nor sweep it aside as nonsense. We treat it as a serious cautionary case. It may contain evidence of unusually severe destruction. It certainly became the centre of a major airburst claim. That claim was challenged and retracted, so the strongest version should not be presented as settled fact. But the questions it raised remain important. How do we identify ancient airburst events? What evidence would be strong enough? How do we distinguish impact-related materials from local burning, industry, or contamination? Could other ancient settlements have been affected by cosmic events and left traces we have not recognized? And how do we tell these stories without turning uncertainty into either dogma or dismissal? Those questions matter far beyond one site. If a cosmic airburst destroyed an ancient city, it would not necessarily look exactly like a crater. It might leave a broad damage layer, unusual melt products, burned materials, scattered debris, and a sudden abandonment. But each of those features can have other explanations. The future of this kind of research will depend on careful sampling, transparent methods, independent replication, and a willingness to let dramatic ideas fail if the evidence does not support them. That last part is difficult. Dramatic ideas are sticky. Once the image of a city burned by a skyburst enters the mind, it does not leave easily. It sits there like a cat in a warm laundry basket, very pleased with itself and impossible to move without some fuss. As night settles around this part of the story, Tall el-Hammam remains suspended between possibilities. There was a city. There was destruction. There were claims of extraordinary heat and pressure. There were challenges. There was a retraction. There is still a ruin in the Jordan Valley, still a record in the ground, still an argument about what kind of event can burn, break and erase so much. Whether the final explanation is cosmic, human, geological, or some combination of ordinary forces made unusually severe, the site reminds us that the ancient world was not safe from sudden endings. Its cities were not protected by their age, their walls, or their importance. They could vanish into ash and debris, leaving later generations to ask whether the enemy came from the road, from the fault beneath the ground, from the fire inside the city, or from the sky itself. And that question follows us onward, because Tal el-Hammam is not the only ancient place wrapped in stories of sudden destruction. Other names have gathered even stronger legends around them, some based on real archaeological puzzles, others inflated by rumour, mistranslation, or the irresistible human habit of making the past more explosive than it may have been. Among them are Mohenjo-daro, the great city of the Indus, and Tanis, the Egyptian city pulled from sand and imagination, both waiting with their own damaged stones, broken stories, and claims that need to be handled with the same calm care. From the debated destruction layer of Tal el-Hammam, where a city may or may not have faced a force from the sky, the trail now turns toward two names that have collected some of the most dramatic stories in the whole strange world of ancient catastrophe: Mohenjo-daro and Tanis. One stands in the Indus landscape of present-day Pakistan, built of baked brick, drains, streets, wells, courtyards, and the ordered habits of one of the earliest great urban civilizations. The other lies in Egypt's Nile Delta, a city of temples, royal burials, reused monuments, wet ground, broken stone, and a reputation made larger by archaeology, treasure, and, rather unfairly, cinema. Both places are real. Both are important. Both are surrounded by stories of sudden destruction. And in both cases, the stories have sometimes moved much faster than the evidence, which is a very human thing to do, though not always a helpful one. Mohenjo-daro is the more famous of the two in the world of extreme claims. Its modern name is often translated as the Mound of the Dead, which already gives it a dramatic advantage before anyone has even looked at the excavation records. It was one of the major cities of the Indus civilization, thriving roughly in the 3rd millennium BCE, at a time when Egypt was raising pyramids and Mesopotamia was building cities of its own. But Mohenjo-daro does not look like Egypt or Mesopotamia. It does not give us giant royal tombs, obvious palaces, or huge statues of kings pointing sternly into eternity. Instead, it gives us planning, streets laid out with care, baked brick construction, drainage systems, wells, bathing platforms, standardized weights, seals with undeciphered signs. Houses and lanes that suggest an urban life organized with remarkable consistency, but without the familiar monuments of rulers shouting, "This was definitely mine," across the centuries. That absence has made Mohenjo-daro both fascinating and frustrating. We can see the city's order, but we cannot yet read its script. We can walk the streets, but we cannot hear the names people used for them. We can see drains and rooms and platforms, but we do not know the stories told at dinner, the rules of government, the prayers, the jokes, the songs, or whether someone was forever complaining that the neighbour's goat had got into the courtyard again. The city is full of evidence, yet still quiet in the areas where written history usually speaks. This silence leaves room for careful scholarship, but it also leaves room for invention. And Mohenjo-daro has received a great deal of invention. The most dramatic legend is that Mohenjo-daro was destroyed by an ancient nuclear explosion. According to this story, the city was found with bodies lying in the streets, high radiation, vitrified stone, and evidence of heat so intense that it could only have come from weapons far beyond the Bronze Age. It is a powerful image. Too powerful, perhaps. A lost city. A sudden blast. People frozen in their last moments. Brick and stone turned to glass. Ancient texts misunderstood as myth, but really describing atomic war. It sounds like the opening to a very successful documentary with ominous music, or the sort of book that has lightning on the cover and asks a question it has already decided the answer to. But when we slow down and look at the archaeological record, the picture becomes much less explosive. The famous skeletons were not found as a vast population lying across the entire city in one destruction layer. Early excavations over many years found a small number of skeletal remains scattered in different places and contexts. Some were incomplete. Some may have been disturbed. Some were not clearly part of one single event. The idea of streets full of unburied victims from one instant of annihilation does not match the careful archaeological summaries. Mohenjo-daro was not a city where tens of thousands of people were found in place, caught by a blast. The numbers are small, the context varied, and the interpretation far more complicated. The radiation claim is also weak. The repeated story that skeletons from Mohenjo-daro were highly radioactive does not come from solid excavation data. It appears to have passed through layers of popular retelling, misquotation, and confusion with unrelated claims, becoming more impressive each time, like a fish that grows larger with every person who describes it. There is no accepted archaeological evidence that Mohenjo-daro contains the radiation signature of a nuclear event, nor is there accepted evidence that its buildings were turned to glass by a citywide thermal blast. Baked brick is not the same thing as vitrified ruin. The Indus people deliberately made bricks in kilns. They used fire as part of construction, because fired brick survives water and wear better than sun-dried mud brick. A city made of baked brick has already passed through heat at the level of material production. That does not mean the whole city was later melted by a weapon. This is an important point because Mohenjo-daro's bricks are sometimes misunderstood. A baked brick can look heat-altered because it was made by heat. Its red colour, hardness and durability are not a sign of disaster. They're a sign of technology. The Indus civilization used fired bricks at large scale, which required fuel, organisation, standardisation and craft knowledge. In a flood-prone, riverine environment, that made practical sense. But if someone arrives already looking for evidence of a great burning, the very material of the city can be misread as the scar of destruction. It is a bit like walking into a bakery, smelling bread, and concluding there must have been an emergency because everything has clearly been exposed to heat. Technically, yes, but also that is rather the point of the place. Mohenjo-daro did decline, and the wider Indus urban system changed profoundly after its height. But current explanations tend to involve gradual and regional processes rather than one sudden blast. Changing river systems, climate shifts, declining urban organisation, altered trade networks, social transformations, resource pressures, and migration all belong to the discussion. The great cities of the Indus world did not necessarily fall in one dramatic night. Many signs point instead toward deurbanisation, a shift away from large urban centres, with populations dispersing or reorganising over time. That kind of ending is less cinematic, but historically common. Civilizations often change not with a single flash, but with many pressures building slowly until old systems no longer hold. The drains still exist, the streets remain, the bricks are there, but the pattern of life that made them work has gone elsewhere. There is something strangely hard for us to accept about gradual collapse. We prefer endings with a cause we can point to. A volcano, an invasion, a meteor, a weapon, a flood, a plague, a villain, ideally one wearing something memorable. Slow change feels unsatisfying. It leaves no single moment when someone can say, there, that is when the world ended. But for many ancient cities, the end may have been spread across generations. A neighbourhood empties, a building is not repaired, a trade route weakens, floods become more troublesome, wells silt up, officials lose authority, families move, crafts shift, the city remains inhabited, then less inhabited, then partly abandoned, then reused, then buried, then forgotten. By the time the ruin looks dead to us, the death may have happened by many small departures rather than one catastrophe. This does not mean Mohenjo-daro was peaceful until everyone politely packed and left. There may have been violence. There may have been disease, local conflict, hardship, floods, and fire. Human history rarely manages to avoid those for long, but the evidence does not support the popular image of an atomic or cosmic destruction event. And in a way, the real Mohenjo-daro is more interesting than the myth. A nuclear war story turns the city into a prop for someone else's fantasy about lost technology. The real city asks harder questions. How was such urban order maintained without obvious kings? How did its drainage and water systems work socially as well as technically? Why did the script remain undeciphered? How did households differ? What did people believe? Why did the urban system change after centuries of success? Those questions may not produce a glowing crater, but they bring us closer to actual human lives. Still, the legend persists because it satisfies a certain mood. It suggests that the ancient past was once as advanced and dangerous as the modern world. It tells us that our technologies may not be unique, that civilizations have risen to frightening power before and destroyed themselves, perhaps leaving only ruins and warnings. There is a moral appeal in that. A lost nuclear war in antiquity becomes a cautionary tale about modern arrogance. It says, perhaps we are not the first to hold terrible fire. Perhaps we are repeating a cycle. It is understandable why people are drawn to that. But an emotionally satisfying story is not the same as archaeological evidence. The past can warn us without needing to have already built our exact mistakes in advance. Tanis is a different kind of case. It does not usually carry the nuclear legend in the same way, but it has its own atmosphere of sudden loss. The name alone may make some people think of a city swallowed by sand, thanks in part to modern adventure fiction and film, where Tanis becomes an almost mythic lost place buried by a catastrophic storm. The real Tanis is not that. It lies in the northeastern Nile Delta, known in Arabic as San el-Hagar, and it was an important city during Egypt's Third Intermediate Period. It became a royal capital after the decline of Pyrameses, and its temples and royal necropolis made it a major centre. It was not an imaginary city erased overnight by divine wind. It was a real political and religious place, built in a shifting delta landscape where water, silt, monuments, reuse, and later confusion all played their parts. Part of Tanis's strangeness comes from reuse. Many of the impressive stone monuments found there were not originally made for Tanis. They were brought from earlier sites, especially Pyrameses and other places, and reused. Statues, blocks, obelisks, and inscriptions carrying the names of older pharaohs ended up in Tanis, creating a ruined feel that can look older and more complicated than the city's own main period of importance. Early explorers and scholars were sometimes confused by this, and understandably so. If you find monuments of Rameses II scattered through a city, you may think you have found the city of Rameses. Later work clarified that Tanis had inherited and reused these materials. In other words, Tanis was partly built from memories made elsewhere. That is not a sign of sudden destruction. It is a sign of political recycling on a monumental scale, which sounds much grander than taking an old shelf and turning it into a shoe rack. But the principle is not entirely unrelated. The Nile Delta is also not like the dry desert settings we often imagine for Egyptian archaeology. It is wetter, lower, more changeable, and harder on certain materials. Wood decays, mud brick erodes, groundwater rises, silt covers. Settlements shift as river branches change. Archaeology in the delta can be difficult because the landscape itself is restless. A city there may disappear not because of one catastrophe, but because water routes moved, political power shifted, buildings were dismantled, stone was reused, and soft materials returned to mud. The ruins of Tanis can therefore feel like the remains of a shattered place, but the shattering may represent long processes of reuse, abandonment, and environmental change rather than one destructive moment. And yet Tanis did produce one of the great archaeological surprises of Egypt, the royal tombs discovered by Pierre Montet in the late 1930s and early 1940s. These tombs contain the burials of kings, such as Suzeni I, with precious objects, gold masks, silver coffins, jewellery, and evidence of a royal world that had been overshadowed in popular imagination by Tutankhamun. The timing of the discovery during the Second World War meant that it did not seize global attention in the same way. Had it been found in a quieter decade, perhaps Tanis would be far more famous today. Instead, it remains slightly hidden in public memory, a major discovery tucked behind louder history. There is something almost fitting about that for a delta city, half visible, half misunderstood, quietly holding treasures under damp ground. The treasures of Tanis do not tell us the city was destroyed by a blast. They tell us that power continued in complex forms after Egypt's New Kingdom glory had faded. The Third Intermediate Period is often described as a time of fragmentation, regional power, shifting authority, and divided rule. But fragmentation is not the same as emptiness. People still built, ruled, buried, traded, prayed, and displayed wealth. Tanis was part of that world. Its ruins look broken now, but all ruins look broken eventually. A fallen column does not automatically mean catastrophe. A reused statue does not mean an explosion. A buried city does not mean a single sandstorm swallowed it whole, while everyone gasped theatrically and dropped their shopping. That last image matters because popular culture has trained us to expect ancient cities to vanish dramatically. We like cities buried in one night, temples swallowed by jungle, palaces drowned by the sea, libraries burned by invaders, civilizations struck by comets, and kings cursed for touching the wrong object. Sometimes sudden catastrophes really do happen. Pompeii was buried by Vesuvius. Thera erupted. Earthquakes toppled cities. Tsunamis struck coastlines. Fires consumed palaces. The world is perfectly capable of drama without our help. But many ruins became ruins through slower, less photogenic processes. Political relevance moved elsewhere. Rivers changed course. Economies declined. Buildings were robbed for stone. Later generations camped in old temples. Farmers ploughed over ancient walls. Sand and silt covered what people stopped maintaining. The result can look sudden when viewed from far enough away, because centuries compress in the imagination. Mohenjo-daro and Tanis therefore teach the same lesson from opposite directions. Mohenjo-daro is turned into a sudden technological catastrophe because its silence invites speculation. Tanis is turned into a sudden lost city because its broken monuments and later reputation make good adventure material. In both cases, the real archaeological story is more layered. Mohenjo-daro was a sophisticated urban centre whose decline belongs to the wider transformation of the Indus world, not a proven nuclear event. Tanis was a real Egyptian capital and religious centre whose ruins reflect reuse, delta conditions and long historical change, not a city demonstrably erased by a single storm or weapon. Neither needs the legend to be interesting. The legend is the extra sugar someone added to an already rich cake, and after a point you can no longer taste the cake. Still, legends are not useless. They reveal what we want from the past. The Mohenjo-daro nuclear story reveals our modern fear of self-destruction. It takes the anxiety of the atomic age and projects it backward, as if to say that humanity has already stood at this dangerous threshold before. The Tanis sandstorm or lost city image reveals our love of buried treasure and sudden disappearance. The fantasy that an entire world can be hidden under sand until someone with a hat, a map, and very durable trousers finds it. These legends tell us less about the ancient cities than about ourselves. We look at ruins and see not only what happened there, but what we fear might happen to us. Empty streets become warnings, broken walls become mirrors, old cities become rehearsal spaces for modern concerns. The challenge is to keep the wonder while removing the false certainty. Mohenjo-daro does not become dull when the nuclear story fades. It becomes more human. We can imagine its wells being used daily, its drains maintained, its brick platforms washed, Its seal makers carving signs we still cannot read, its children playing with terracotta toys, its merchants weighing goods, its households managing water, food, heat, and storage. The city's mystery is not a blast. It is the organisation of everyday life at a scale that still impresses us. Tanis does not become dull when the buried by sandstorm image fades. It becomes more historically tangled. We can imagine priests of Amun, kings of a divided Egypt, reuse statues bearing older names, tomb builders working in damp ground, later excavators opening chambers that had held royal dead in quiet darkness. The real stories are slower, but they are not smaller. There is also a useful caution about heat in both places. At Mohenjo-daro, fired brick and domestic or craft fires should not be mistaken for citywide vitrification. Heat was part of urban technology, not necessarily evidence of destruction. At Tanis, stone damage, broken monuments, and weathered surfaces should not be mistaken for proof of sudden thermal catastrophe. Egypt's delta can distress materials in ways that do not require fire from heaven. In both cases, the appearance of ruin can mislead. A burned material must be understood through context. A skeleton must be understood through excavation layers. A broken statue must be understood through reuse, transport, and later damage. Without context, every object becomes available for any story, and the most dramatic story usually arrives first, breathing heavily and waving its arms. The phrase sudden destruction is powerful because it gives ruins a moment. It turns slow history into a scene, but ruins often resist scenes. They are accumulations. Mohenjo-daro was excavated from mounds built by centuries of occupation, rebuilding, decay, and burial. Tanis accumulated monuments from elsewhere, histories from different dynasties, tombs, temples, and later damage. They are not single events frozen in stone. They are stacks of events, some dramatic, some ordinary, some visible, some missing. To understand them, we have to resist the urge to flatten them into one night, one blast, one storm, one weapon. Ancient cities deserve more patience than that. They took centuries to become themselves. Their endings may have been just as complex. And yet there is a reason these legends cling so tightly. A city that slowly empties is sad in a quiet way. A city destroyed in an instant is terrifying in a way the mind can grasp. We can picture the instant, we can draw it, film it, narrate it, and build suspense around it. Slow collapse is harder to hold. It is made of administration, weather, trade, maintenance, migration, illness, river changes, and decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. It is less like thunder and more like a roof beam weakening over years until one rainy night it finally gives way. Both are destruction, one just makes a louder noise. So as we leave Mohenjo-daro and Tanis behind for now, they leave us with a careful habit. Do not confuse a powerful legend with a proven event. Do not confuse silence with permission to invent anything. Do not confuse fired materials with melted cities, or broken monuments with catastrophic blasts. But also, do not lose the sense of strangeness. Mohenjo-daro remains an extraordinary city whose script still waits unread. Tanis remains a delta capital whose monuments and tombs still complicate easy ideas of Egyptian decline. Both remind us that ruins can become famous not only for what happened to them, but for what later people needed them to mean. That need for meaning leads naturally into the larger question waiting behind all these sites. If some ancient heat damage is ordinary, some deliberate, some exaggerated, and some possibly catastrophic, how do we sort the possibilities? When does a burned wall belong to warfare? When does fused stone belong to craft? When does glass belong to lightning, impact, or airburst? And when people speak of ancient technology, global catastrophe, or forgotten natural violence, what kind of evidence would actually move those ideas from imagination into history? By now, the trail has carried us through quite a range of ruins, surfaces, stones, fires, and stories. We have stood, at least in the imagination, on Scottish hilltops where ramparts fused under heat that seems too great for an ordinary blaze. We have crossed Egypt's dry reaches, where human-made glazes and desert glass remind us that heat can be both technology and catastrophe. We have looked at Peru's tight-fitting stones, where the mystery is often not burning but precision, and where the idea of softened masonry has grown around walls that may instead speak of patient skill. We have paused at Tall el-Hammam, where a dramatic airburst proposal raised the possibility of a city damaged by heat and pressure from the sky, while also showing how strongly such claims must be tested. And we have walked through the legends around Mohenjo-daro and Tanis, where sudden destruction sometimes belongs more to later imagination than to the ground itself. So now the question becomes wider, and perhaps more difficult. When ancient stone looks altered by force, what are we really seeing? Ancient technology, cosmic catastrophe, or nature's forgotten violence? It is tempting, of course, to choose one grand answer. Human minds enjoy grand answers. They are tidy, they make good titles, they allow us to sweep many scattered mysteries into one basket and carry it proudly around the room. A vitrified fort, a desert glass field, a fused-looking wall, a burned city, a myth of fire from heaven, and there we have it, proof of a lost global cataclysm or a vanished advanced civilization. It is an exciting thought. It has the clean shape of a story. But the world, ancient and modern, is rarely that cooperative. The more carefully we look, the more these examples separate into different categories. Some are clearly human craft. Some are ordinary fire made extreme by structure and fuel. Some are damage from war, accident or abandonment. Some are natural glass from high-energy events. Some are misread surfaces. Some are genuine open questions. The difficulty is not that there are no explanations. The difficulty is that there are many explanations, and each one has to earn its place. Ancient technology is the first possibility we should treat seriously, but perhaps not in the way it is often meant. When people say ancient technology, they sometimes mean machines beyond anything known to archaeology. Lost power sources, stones softening rays, vanished engines, weapons with the heat of the sun, or tools inherited from a prehistoric civilization that rose and fell before recorded history began. Those ideas are dramatic, but there is a quieter and more useful meaning of ancient technology. It means the real technologies ancient people definitely had and used, with great skill: kilns, furnaces, charcoal production, lime burning, pottery firing, faience making, glass working, metal smelting, quarrying, pounding, grinding, polishing, lifting, measuring, draining, terracing, and organising labour. These are not small things. A kiln is not just a hole with fire in it. A furnace is not just a campfire with ambition. To control heat, air, fuel, timing, and material response without modern instruments requires experience built over generations. This matters because many so-called impossible traces become less impossible when we restore ancient skill to the picture. A glazed object in Egypt may be the product of sophisticated craft. A fired brick city in the Indus Valley may reflect large-scale brick production rather than disaster. A fused hill fort wall in Scotland may result from timber-laced ramparts burning under conditions that turn the wall into something like a crude furnace. A smooth Andean wall may reflect extraordinary stone shaping rather than melted rock. In each case, ancient technology is real, but it is not necessarily lost super science. It is practical intelligence, passed through hands, eyes, bodies, and habits. It is the kind of knowledge that does not always leave a manual behind. And because it does not leave a manual, later people sometimes mistake the result for magic. This is, in fairness, understandable. If you have ever opened a cupboard, found a perfectly repaired object, and had no idea who fixed it or how, you may already know the feeling. Now imagine the cupboard is a mountain, and the repaired object weighs 40 tons. There is also a tendency to underestimate slow work. modern life trains us to value speed. We think in terms of cranes, engines, lasers, steel tools, computer models, and electric furnaces. When we see a huge stone fitted into a wall, we ask how it was done quickly, because that is the kind of efficiency we're used to. But ancient monumental building often worked on different terms. Labour could be mobilised seasonally or permanently. Projects could last years or generations. Religious and political motives could justify effort that would seem absurd for everyday construction. A stone might be shaped through repeated testing and adjustment, not because it was easy, but because the society behind it valued the result enough to make it happen. Time itself was part of the toolkit. A great deal becomes possible when a community can spend months doing what a modern person would prefer to accomplish before lunch. Still, ancient technology does not explain every trace. Some materials require natural forces beyond ordinary human work. Libyan Desert glass, for example, is not the result of a village workshop quietly making ornaments in the Great Sand Sea. It points to extreme heat on a landscape scale, most likely linked in some way to cosmic impact or airburst processes, even though the details have been debated. Other impact glasses and tektites around the world show that the Earth has repeatedly been struck or affected by high-energy events that transform rock and sediment into glass. Lightning can make fulgurites, tubes, or fused forms where sand or soil is melted along the path of a strike. Volcanoes can produce glassy obsidian and other fused materials. Wildfires can alter soil and stone. Earthquakes can shatter cities. Tsunamis can move boulders. Landslides can bury settlements. Floods can erase fields and walls. Nature has never been short of destructive methods. It does not need human permission to become dramatic. Cosmic catastrophe is one of the most powerful ideas because it comes from outside the human world. A war can be understood as human violence. A kiln can be understood as human craft. But a meteor, a comet fragment, or an airburst belongs to a larger scale. It reminds us that civilization exists under a sky that is mostly harmless, until suddenly it is not. The Earth travels through space surrounded by debris, most of it small, much of it burned away in the atmosphere, some of it large enough to matter. The dinosaur-killing impact at the end of the Cretaceous is the most famous example of cosmic violence shaping life. Smaller events have happened many times. Some left craters, some may have exploded in the air, some struck oceans or remote regions and left a little human memory. If such an event happened over an ancient settlement, the people there would not have called it a meteor airburst. They might have called it fire from heaven, a star falling, a divine weapon, a cursed wind, or simply the day the world broke. This is where myth enters the discussion, and myth must be treated with both respect and caution. Ancient stories of floods, fires, falling stars, angry gods, burning cities, and darkened skies may preserve memories of real disasters. They may also transform ordinary events into moral or religious narratives. A flood story might recall a local flood, a regional sea level change, a mythic cleansing, or a symbolic reset. A story of fire from the sky might preserve an airburst, a volcanic eruption, lightning, warfare, or a theological lesson. The problem is that myths are not scientific reports. They do not preserve data cleanly. They compress, exaggerate, moralize, rearrange, and travel between cultures. A myth can be a clue, but it is not a conclusion. It points us toward questions, not answers. Treating myth as memory can be valuable. Treating it as a literal laboratory record is where trouble begins, usually carrying a notebook full of exclamation marks. So what would prove a cosmic event at an ancient ruin? Not just a legend, not just a burned layer, not just a shiny stone. The evidence would need to be multiple, consistent, and securely dated. Researchers would look for high-temperature melt products that cannot be explained by local fires or industry. They might search for shocked minerals formed under extreme pressure. They might look for spherules or unusual chemical signatures associated with extraterrestrial material though these must be handled carefully because many processes can make small round particles. They would examine the distribution of damage across the site and region. They would ask whether buildings were flattened in a pattern consistent with a blast wave. They would compare the dates of destruction across nearby settlements. They would test whether the proposed event left a signal in sediments beyond the city. They would invite other researchers to check the samples, repeat the analyses, and try to disprove the claim. That last step is important. A strong idea should survive being challenged. If it only works when protected from criticism, it is not evidence yet. It is a nervous story wearing a lab coat. Ancient advanced technology would require the same discipline. It is not enough to say that a stone wall looks impossible. We would need tools, waste products, workshop remains, energy sources, failed attempts, inscriptions, manufacturing traces, consistent patterns, and material evidence that known methods cannot produce. Real technologies usually leave ecosystems of evidence. Pottery kilns leave wasters, ash, fuel remains, firing structures, clay preparation areas, and misfired pieces. Metalworking leaves slag, crucibles, tuyères, furnaces, ore fragments, tools, and chemical residues. Stoneworking leaves quarries, unfinished blocks, tool marks, chips, abrasives, transport routes, and broken attempts. A lost high-energy technology capable of melting walls or softening megaliths should leave something more than the finished mystery. It should leave traces of production, maintenance, use, accident, and failure. People who use technology also break it, repair it, discard it, argue about it, and occasionally leave it somewhere inconvenient. The archaeological record loves rubbish. If an advanced technology was widespread, its rubbish should be somewhere. That does not mean every lost technique must leave obvious traces. Some knowledge can vanish almost completely, especially if it used organic materials, perishable tools, or oral instruction. But the bigger and more energetic the claimed technology, the harder it is for all supporting evidence to disappear. A plant-based polishing compound might leave little behind. A nuclear-like weapon or stone-melting machine should leave a great deal. This is why extraordinary claims need more than impressive-looking stones. They need a chain of evidence, not one link, but many. The more dramatic the claim, the stronger the chain must be. Otherwise, we risk using mystery as a shortcut around patient explanation. Nature's forgotten violence, on the other hand, may leave evidence that is easy to miss because we do not always know what to look for. Airbursts may not leave craters. Tsunamis may leave deposits that later erode. Earthquakes may be mistaken for poor construction. Ancient wildfires may be confused with domestic burning. Volcanic events may affect regions far from the volcano through ash, climate disruption, or trade collapse. Droughts may leave no dramatic layer of destruction, yet end a city more effectively than an army. Climate shifts can alter rivers, crops, migration, and political systems. A city may not be burned in one day, but slowly strangled by environmental change. Nature's violence is not always loud. Sometimes it is persistent. It changes rainfall, moves a river branch, salinizes fields, lowers harvests, and waits while humans try to adapt. That kind of catastrophe does not make glass, but it can end worlds. The idea of a lost prehistoric civilization often grows from the overlap between these categories. Ancient people did impressive things. Natural catastrophes happened. Myths describe dramatic events. Some ruins contain unexplained heat damage. Put those together, and the imagination begins to build a much larger structure. Perhaps there was once an advanced civilization before known history, destroyed by global cataclysm, leaving fragments of knowledge in Egypt, Peru, India, Scotland, and beyond. It is an appealing idea because it gives unity to scattered mysteries. It also gives the past a hidden depth, a sense that history is not merely incomplete but dramatically concealed. And to be fair, mainstream history is incomplete. There are lost cultures, submerged landscapes, erased settlements, undeciphered scripts, and entire ways of life known only through scraps. The end of the last ice age brought major environmental changes, rising seas, shifting coastlines, and the loss of lands once inhabited by people. Human prehistory is far richer and more complex than older textbooks once suggested. But richness is not the same as evidence for a single global high-tech civilization. We must be careful not to take gaps in knowledge and fill them with whatever story feels grandest. The world before writing was not empty. It was full of people observing, building, hunting, farming, sailing, trading, carving, burying, remembering and adapting. Some communities may have been more complex than we currently know. Some coastal settlements may lie underwater. Some knowledge traditions may be gone. That is all true and exciting. But a global civilization capable of advanced energy systems, megalithic melting, and worldwide catastrophe would need a pattern of evidence much stronger than scattered similarities. Similar shapes in stonework do not prove shared technology. Flood myths do not prove one event everywhere. Melted materials do not all require one cause. Humans in different places often solve similar problems in similar ways because gravity, stone, water, fire, and human bodies are similar everywhere. A wall must stand, a roof must span, a fire must breathe. A field must drain, a ruler must impress people. These pressures produce echoes without requiring one lost source. One of the best ways to avoid confusion is to separate evidence by scale. A local melted wall asks for a local explanation first. What materials were present? What fuel? What event? What date? A regional glass deposit asks for a regional geological explanation. What energy source could affect that landscape? An urban collapse asks for social and environmental explanation. What changed in water, trade, governance, disease, warfare, or climate? A global cataclysm requires global evidence, widespread deposits, synchronized dates, climate signals, impact markers, sea level changes, abrupt cultural disruptions, and independent confirmation across regions. Without scale, we can accidentally use a local clue to support a global story. That is like finding a burnt piece of toast and declaring the whole bakery exploded. Possible, perhaps, but one should check the toaster first. There is also a difference between mystery and contradiction. A mystery is something we do not yet understand fully. A contradiction is something that cannot fit known explanations. Many ancient heat traces are mysteries in the first sense, not contradictions in the second. Vitrified forts are difficult, but timber-laced walls and intense burning offer plausible mechanisms. Andean masonry is astonishing, but known stoneworking principles can explain much, even if details remain debated. Desert glass is extreme, but natural impact-related processes are real. Mohenjo-daro is mysterious in its decline and undeciphered script, but not evidence of nuclear war. Tall el-Hammam is debated, but the airburst claim has not become secure fact. The danger is turning every mystery into a contradiction before the ordinary explanations have been tested properly. Still, ordinary does not mean dull. A timber wall burning hot enough to fuse stone is extraordinary even if no lost weapon is involved. A Bronze Age city destroyed by war or earthquake is tragic even if no meteor fell. A desert glass field formed by natural cosmic violence is astonishing even if no human saw it happen. A megalithic wall shaped by patient craft is remarkable even if no stone softening potion was used. The desire for advanced lost technology sometimes comes from a good instinct, the instinct to feel wonder. The problem is not wonder. The problem is when wonder becomes impatient. Patient wonder is better. It allows ancient people to be skilled, nature to be powerful, and evidence to be complicated all at once. Perhaps the most honest answer is that all three categories have their place, but not everywhere. Ancient technology explains some traces, especially when we include real craft knowledge rather than imaginary machinery. Cosmic catastrophe explains some natural glasses and impact-related features, and may explain some archaeological destruction in rare cases, but only with strong evidence. Nature's forgotten violence explains many collapses, fires, floods, earthquakes, droughts, and environmental shifts that shape the ancient world. The lost civilization idea remains a possibility only in the broad and cautious sense that much of prehistory is unknown, and some complex societies may have left fewer traces than we expect. But the stronger version, a global advanced civilization behind all these heat mysteries, needs evidence it has not yet provided. It is not enough for stones to look strange. Stones are allowed to look strange. They have had a very long time to practice. As we hold these possibilities together, the subject becomes less about solving one puzzle and more about learning how to look. A blackened wall asks us not to jump. A glassy surface asks us to test. A legend asks us to listen, but not obey. A spectacular claim asks for patience. A ruined city asks for compassion as well as curiosity. Because whatever caused its ending, people lived there first. Behind every destruction layer is an ordinary day interrupted, or a long decline endured, or a final abandonment chosen because staying was no longer possible. The heat marks are not just clues. They are traces of lives that met forces larger than themselves, whether those forces were human, natural, or cosmic. And as the trail begins to bend toward its quiet end, the question becomes softer, but not smaller. What do these melted stones, fused walls, glazed fragments, broken cities, and desert glasses really whisper to us? Not only what happened here, but what do we do with what remains? How do we live with uncertainty, with lost knowledge, with fragile civilizations, and with the knowledge that even stone can change when the world grows hot enough? By the time we come back from all these places, the question that first sounded simple has become much larger. What melted these ancient ruins? At first, it seemed as if we were asking about heat, stone, glass, and fire. But really we've been asking how the past leaves evidence, how people explain what they do not fully understand, and how easily a damaged wall can become a doorway into imagination. A fused rampart in Scotland, a piece of yellow glass in the desert, a fitted stone in Peru, a burned city layer in the Jordan Valley, an old Indus street, a broken Egyptian monument. Each one seems to say, look closer, not louder, not faster, not with a conclusion already waiting in your pocket, but closer. And perhaps that is the first quiet lesson of these melted and almost melted places. Ruins do not explain themselves in one voice. They do not sit in the ground with a neat label saying, burned by invaders, heated by kiln, struck by skyburst, damaged by salt, carved by patient workers, misunderstood by someone on the internet at 1:17 in the morning. That would be helpful, of course. An archaeologist would probably appreciate it very much. Instead, ruins leave fragments. A darkened stone, a fused seam, a layer of ash, a broken jar, a mineral grain altered by pressure, a wall joint so precise it makes the fingers pause, a surface that looks glossy in the sun. These fragments are real, but the story around them must be built carefully, one small support at a time. There is a gentle humility in that. Stone seems permanent, but even stone can change. It can be cut, burned, polished, cracked, weathered, buried, reused, misunderstood, and admired by people who arrive far too late to ask the builders what they meant. We often think of ruins as fixed things, as if the moment a city is abandoned it becomes a frozen photograph. But ruins continue to live in their own slow way. Rain enters cracks, salt grows inside pores, sun heats surfaces by day and cold contracts them by night. Plants root into joints, people take blocks for new buildings, wind polishes edges, sand covers walls, later fires leave later marks, excavators uncover one layer and change the conditions of another. A ruin is not only the remains of an ancient event, it is also the result of everything that happened afterward. Time is not a glass case. It is more like a very patient editor, revising the same paragraph for centuries and occasionally spilling tea on it. That is why the word melted can be both useful and dangerous. Useful because some ancient materials really were heated to the point of fusion. Dangerous because it can make different things sound the same. A vitrified Scottish fort is not the same as Egyptian faience. Libyan desert glass is not the same as a smoked temple ceiling. A tight Inca wall is not the same as softened stone. Baked brick is not the same as nuclear ruin. A fire-damaged city is not automatically a meteor strike. The world gives us many kinds of heat, and human imagination tends to gather them into one glowing pile. But if we separate them again, the story becomes richer, not smaller. The Scottish forts remind us that ordinary materials can produce extraordinary results when arranged in the right way. Timber, stone, wind, and enclosed spaces can turn a defensive wall into a furnace. Whether by attack, abandonment, accident, or ritual, those ramparts burned hot enough to alter stone, and that alone is remarkable. They do not need to prove impossible technology to deserve our attention. They show how human construction can create unexpected conditions, and how fire, once invited into a structure, may behave with a confidence nobody asked for. Egypt reminds us that ancient people did not merely suffer heat, they mastered it. They used fire to make colour, shine, hardness, and meaning. Faience tiles, glazed objects, glass beads, pottery, pigments, and metalwork all show skilled control of transformation. At the same time, the Libyan desert glass reminds us that nature can produce heat on a scale no workshop could match. Somewhere in the deep past, an event powerful enough to transform sand into glass left fragments that later humans found, shaped, and valued. That little chain of events, from cosmic or impact-related heat to royal ornament, is almost too strange to improve upon. History does not always need embellishment. Sometimes it has already done the dramatic part for us. Peru teaches a different lesson. Not every mystery that looks like melting belongs to fire. Some stones seem fused because they are fitted with such care that separation becomes hard to imagine. The walls of Sacsayhuaman and other Andean sites do not require stone to have been softened like wax in order to be impressive. They require us to take ancient skill seriously. The shaping, transport, measuring, placing and adjusting of enormous stones was a technology of patience, organisation and experience. To say people did it by hand is not to make it simple. Hands guided by knowledge can accomplish things that later machines may find easier, but not more meaningful. A tight stone joint is not less astonishing because it was made by people. It is astonishing because it was made by people. Tall el-Hammam leaves us with caution. A dramatic idea can be worth exploring and still not be proven. A city may have been destroyed severely without the sky being responsible. Or perhaps, in some cases elsewhere, the sky really was responsible, but evidence must be strong enough to carry that claim. The idea of an airburst burning a Bronze Age city is powerful, because airbursts are physically possible, but possible is not the same as demonstrated. The ground must support the story. Samples must withstand criticism. Patterns must repeat. Other explanations must be tested. And when a claim weakens, the honest thing is not to pretend the mystery is solved anyway, but to let the uncertainty remain where it belongs. Mohenjo-daro and Tanis show how legends grow around silence. Mohenjo-daro did not need a nuclear war to become mysterious. Its streets, drains, wells, bricks and unread signs already offer one of the great puzzles of the ancient world. Tanis did not need a single sandstorm to become fascinating. Its reused monuments, delta setting, temples, and royal burials already carry a complex history. Sudden destruction is satisfying as a story, because it gives ruins a clear ending. But many cities ended slowly, unevenly, and without one final scene. That does not make them less important. It makes them more like real life, where change often arrives not with thunder, but with repeated small adjustments that only later become obvious. All of this brings us back to the larger idea of lost civilizations and global catastrophes. It is possible that the prehistoric world was more complex than we once thought. In fact, it almost certainly was. Coastlines have changed. Settlements have drowned beneath rising seas. Wood, fibre, cloth, and many ordinary materials have vanished. Oral traditions have broken. Techniques have disappeared. Entire communities may have left only faint traces because their buildings were not made of durable stone, or because the places they lived are now buried, flooded, or overlooked. We should be open to surprise. The past has surprised us many times before, and it will do so again, probably while looking perfectly innocent in a storage drawer somewhere behind a label. Nobody has checked since 1973. But openness is not the same as accepting every grand theory. A lost prehistoric civilization with advanced heat technology, global reach, and catastrophic destruction would need evidence on that scale. Tools, workshops, waste, settlements, dates, materials, inscriptions, repeated patterns, and clear signs that known methods cannot explain. Until then, it remains an idea, not a conclusion. An interesting idea, perhaps even a useful one if it pushes people to ask better questions, but still an idea. The ruins themselves do not ask us to believe the biggest story. They ask us to look carefully enough to find the right one. There is something comforting about that, especially at the end of a long journey. We do not have to choose between dull certainty and wild speculation. There is a middle path, quieter and much more interesting. On that path, ancient people are skilled. Nature is powerful, myths are meaningful, evidence matters, and some questions remain open without needing to be filled too quickly. A fused wall can be both explainable and wonderful. A glass fragment can be natural and still astonishing. A fitted stone can be made by human hands and still feel impossible when you stand beside it. A burned city can be tragic even if no meteor fell. Wonder does not disappear when we remove the weakest claims. It becomes steadier. And maybe that is what the melted ruins whisper before sleep. Not a single secret, not a final answer hidden under one last stone, but a reminder that the world is older, stranger, and more layered than our quick explanations. Civilizations rise with confidence, build walls, make roads, store grain, carve monuments, fire bricks, polish stones, argue over boundaries, invent rituals, and assume tomorrow will arrive in a recognizable shape. Then fire comes, or drought, or war, or earthquake, or river change, or abandonment, or time itself with its slow and thorough hands. The city changes, the people leave or die or adapt, the wall falls, the stone remains. Later, someone finds it and asks what happened. That question is one of the most human things we do. We ask what happened because we know, somewhere in ourselves, that our own world is not permanent either. Our buildings seem strong, our maps seem settled, our technologies seem impressive, our schedules make tomorrow feel guaranteed. But the ancient ruins remind us that every present moment eventually becomes someone else's past. The things we build may be misunderstood. The marks we leave may be interpreted through theories we never imagined. Someone far in the future may stand before the remains of our cities and wonder why certain materials warped, why towers fell, why plastics fused, why glass cracked, why roads vanished underwater, and whether we understood the forces we were living with. They may give us too much credit. They may give us too little. They may invent a legend involving a sacred device called a router, and honestly, they would not be entirely wrong to be suspicious of it. So perhaps studying ancient heat damage is not only about the past, it is also about paying attention to fragility. Fire changes things quickly. Time changes them slowly. Both are always working somewhere. The same earth that holds our homes has been struck by objects from space, shaken by faults, flooded by seas, dried by climate shifts and altered by human hands. The ancient world was not separate from those forces, and neither are we. But there is no need to turn that thought into fear tonight. Let it become perspective instead. The kind of perspective that makes the present feel a little more precious and a little less ordinary. Think again of a vitrified stone in a Scottish rampart. It was once part of a wall built by people with plans. Then it became part of a fire. Then it cooled. Then grass grew around it. Rain fell. Generations passed. Languages changed. Kingdoms rose and disappeared. Eventually someone studied it and tried to understand the heat that altered it. The stone did not hurry. It kept its record in the only way stone can. Or think of a piece of desert glass lying under the sun. It began as sand, became glass through an event of extreme energy, rested in the desert for ages, was found by humans, shaped into tools or ornaments, and entered history through hands that did not know its full origin. These objects do not speak loudly. They wait for careful attention. That attention is what separates curiosity from mere excitement. Excitement wants the answer now. Curiosity can sit beside the question for a while. It can admit that some claims are doubtful, some evidence is incomplete, and some ancient achievements are better explained by skill than by fantasy. It can also admit that nature has done things far beyond ordinary human experience, and that some ancient disasters may have been larger than surviving records suggest. Curiosity does not flatten the mystery, it lets it breathe. And now, after walking through burned walls, desert glass, fitted stones, debated skybursts, and legends of lost cities, we can return to where we began, with the simple image of stone changed by heat. Stone, the material we trust to endure. Stone, the thing we build with when we want memory to last. Stone, which can still crack, soften, fuse, glaze, or fall when conditions become extreme enough. There is a quiet lesson in that. Endurance is real, but it is never absolute. Even the strongest things have thresholds. Knowing those thresholds does not make the world less wondrous. It makes the wonder more precise. So if tonight's journey has left you with one thought, let it be this. The past is not a solved place. It is a landscape of evidence, silence, skill, damage, and interpretation. Some ruins were burned by people, some were changed by craft, some were altered by natural forces, some have been misunderstood, some still have questions waiting patiently in their stones. And the best way to honour them is not to force them into the most dramatic story, nor to dismiss the mystery because the dramatic story may be wrong, but to keep looking carefully. And here you are now, a little farther along your own evening than when we began. Perhaps the room is darker, perhaps the day feels more distant, perhaps the idea of ancient walls glowing with heat has softened into something quieter, less alarming, more like an old question resting in the mind. If you are still awake, I hope the journey has been curious in a calm sort of way. And if you have drifted somewhere near sleep, then perhaps the melted stones have done what old stones often do best. They have held the mystery for you, so you do not have to hold it too tightly. Before we part, let me ask you once more, gently, where are you listening from tonight, and which ancient place would you most like to stand before in the quiet, with no crowds, no rush, and just enough light to see the stone? If this slow journey through Earth's old mysteries brought you a little calm, I'd be ever so grateful if you liked the video and subscribed. It helps this sleepy corner of curiosity reach other travellers who enjoy history, science, and the occasional ruin that looks as if it has had a very difficult evening. For now, let the questions rest. The forts of Scotland can keep their fused stones under the wind. The deserts of Egypt can keep their glass beneath the sun. The walls of Peru can keep their careful joints in the mountain air. The ruined cities can keep their broken layers until another day. You do not need to solve them tonight. You only need to breathe, settle, and let the old world fade gently into the background. Sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever you are, and may your dreams be quieter than fire, softer than sand and steady as stone cooling under the stars.